Hello and welcome to today's webinar. For 3¼ hours, we'll try to stick to the breaking points as closely as possible, and we do have a few notes to go through before we begin. Please be sure to be logged onto the webinar through your own individual connection so that we can accurately prove attendance in the event that Half Moon or you are audited by any licensing board. We also require individual connections so that you can access the quiz at the end of the webinar. The quiz will automatically appear on your screen after I end the webinar today. If you're not able to successfully submit the quiz, you can always access the quiz via the thank you or follow-up email that is sent about 1 hour after the webinar has ended. Certificates will be issued for today's webinar. If you did not successfully submit the quiz after attending the webinar, please be sure to complete the quiz through the thank you or follow-up email. The certificates will be sent via email in PDF form, and if you need your certificates sooner, please reply back to any emails you have received regarding these seminars or call into our office. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar. If you have questions for Mr. Cromer, you can ask your questions in the questions area of the GoToWebinar panel. Materials for today's webinar were sent via email. If you weren't able to receive the materials, you can access them in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. Once you click on the PDF, the document will open in your default internet browser where you can view, download, or print. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Cromer, Master Electrician, Mechanical Engineer, and Certified Photovoltaic Installation Professional.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our program. Today we're going to get into battery applications and talk about how batteries are integrated into residential, commercial, and utility scale projects. Batteries are going to become increasingly important for a variety of reasons. The number one reason is simply that the volume of batteries is substantially ramping up. So, I got into the solar industry in 2008, and it was pretty thrilling at the time to see the heavy investments in silicon refining for solar dedicated facilities. Those were being developed in the mid-2000s. So by the end of the late 2000s, the solar module cost that was $3.25 a watt began to drop. And within a year's time, it had dropped down to $2 a watt. And then by the end of the next year, it had dropped down to just above $1 a watt. And nowadays, if we didn't have import tariffs, solar modules would cost around 45 to 50 cents a watt. But many countries do have import tariffs that are kind of putting the skids on the solar industry for the time being. So nowadays, being in solar it's a little more mainstream. You can get really kind of fed up with changing utility policies where they over subsidize solar one year and then gut their solar programs the next, and it's a very volatile market. And up until now, you've been kind of subject to the utility rate structure that the utility provides to you. And what batteries allow certain customers to do is optimize the value of the solar array. And what's exciting is that we're here. We can see this exponential growth where the battery market is so small that since at least 2013, the battery market has been doubling in size every year. And then in 2017 in particular, we're starting to see growth rates that are far beyond just even 100% growth. And so if you were in the solar industry in 2008, 2009, 2010, you were used to seeing reports that says the solar industry grows by 100%. The solar industry grows by 300%. Nowadays, it's more like 20%. And so that thrill of being in an exponential growth industry is kind of losing its luster. With batteries, you have to be much more technical in your design. There's a lot to learn. The solar design software on the market is not good for all kinds of batteries. So there's a lot more site customization, and the market is growing so fast that today in the battery industry, it feels a lot like the solar industry did, 5 or 6 years ago. So if you're a nimble solar installer and you're kind of fearful of what the new round of import tariffs will do to the solar industry, the good news is that the battery industry is booming, and especially keeping in mind that most solar arrays today do not have batteries, and that the batteries, even if you don't do the system at the same time, if you do the system today and then add the batteries later, the batteries still qualify for the tax credit. So at least until the solar tax credit gets eliminated, then there is a market of shovel-ready projects for battery retrofits out there, just based on the progress the solar industry has made. So batteries are retrofittable. It's a growing industry. Let's learn about it and see where batteries can be implemented to our projects in a cost-effective manner. Now, remember, the solar industry in 2017 and 2018, even before the talk of all this import tariff, it was already predicted to be in a state of decline, and that's mainly because of the utility scale sector. We still should see some growth, or at least sustained build-outs of solar. Of course, this is modeled without this graph is generated without the import tariff in mind, but this big uptick in utility scale solar projects in 2016 was simply because they thought the tax credit was going to expire at the end of 2016. So developers kind of waited on some of their projects to put in at the last minute in order to get good module pricing. And some projects in 2018 and 2019 were also pushed into 2016 in order to grab on to that tax credit. And I think what this graph is really telling is, first off, the utility scale market is the largest market in the United States for solar. That's not true in all countries, but our electric policies really do favor big energy markets. And it might imply too that the utility scale market, being the largest market in solar, is also the most exposed to changes in the subsidy programs. If that 30% tax credit goes away, if the solar import tariff that is currently on solar modules, if that's doubled, all of these things are being talked about at the federal level. We might see a pop in the utility scale market over the next couple of years. We were already expecting that pop, but it just might be even more accelerated. That's the bad news. We're going to get into the good news in a minute. In our solar class, we talk about soft costs, and mainly we talk about how regular construction margins and soft costs are more like a 30% margin rather than a 50 or 55% margin. And so solar projects, if adopted by mainstream contractors, could be in the 280 a watt range, maybe even getting less, with still having substantial kind of residential mainstream profit margins. And so we talk about how, as far as where's the final price for solar settling at in the residential market, right now it's around $3 a watt, but there is room for that to be reduced. And so I guess actually that was in 2015. Let me erase all this. So we're in 2016 here. And so, the margins, the soft cost margins in residential are like 50%, 55%. And typically in mainstream construction, they're more like 30%. So we could see the solar market going down below 250 a watt as we transition solar into mainstream. To some extent, the subsidies keep the cost of projects high, and certainly not just subsidies, but also the import tariffs. You know, currently the proposed value of the solar import tariff is equal to, at the utility scale, the value of the tax credit. And so we already have the tax credit going away, you know, effectively being taken off the table by the import tariff. And then, you know, Scott Pruitt has said that one of his priorities is to eliminate the solar tax credit. And so we see how, you know, subsidies, tariffs, taxes, you know, we always say, well, you know, why can't we just get rid of all energy subsidies and have everything compete on an even playing field? What batteries are doing is it's going to force the market that way. And perhaps what this means is that electricity prices for sunny rooftops will go down and electricity prices for not sunny rooftops will go up. We'll see how that plays out. Now, the commercial market is installed at a lower price point than residential. And so where the residential pricing today is around $3 a watt, or if you go out to bid for a turnkey contractor, you know, you might be able to get something that is just below $3 a watt. With large scale commercial, when you get into 100 kilowatt, 200 kilowatt projects, you know, what goes down is things like your supply chain overhead, your design and engineering and permitting. Let's see, I think that your labor budget is pretty high on these commercial projects. In my experience, labor budgets go down as well. Excuse me. We do see a slight dip in inverter costs. And the takeaway is that commercial projects can be installed more cheaply than residential. That really shouldn't surprise anyone. What I think is kind of interesting is the cost of commercial solar is actually closer to utility scale project development costs than it is to residential project development costs. And so, you know, if solar works at the utility scale for the time being at a very low value of electricity, and commercial projects can be installed at the point of use, and a lot of commercial projects have peak demand in the middle of the day when solar is productive, you know, what that implies is that the commercial solar market really should be booming. You know, you see a big flat open commercial rooftop, that's a prime market for solar. You know, the problem is when you go to most airports in the United States that are surrounded by warehousing districts, you take off in the airplane and you look out over all these flat rooftops, and on that airplane visit, you're more likely to see a residential array or a utility scale array than you are to see this commercial array. The commercial market is quite small, and that wasn't the case in 2009, 2010, 2011, you know, where actually the commercial rooftop market was the largest market segment. And then we see the utility scale market emerging, the residential market continuing to grow, and kind of growth rates in this commercial market remaining stagnant. Well, why is the commercial market stinking so much? It used to be the biggest market in solar. Now, before the 30% tax credit for solar, the commercial market was the largest market for solar. If we're talking about U.S. history of solar power without subsidies, the commercial market, being that they have their peak demand in the middle of the day and that they have this big open roof to take advantage of economies of scale, you know, the commercial market sector should be the largest market segment, yet it's the smallest market segment. And we have to get into the reasons why. So let's keep moving. You know, when people think of the Tesla Powerwall, they think of it as a residential product that solves a problem around net metering. And so we've talked about how with net metering, you could have no net metering, which means the instant you export onto the grid, you're credited at avoided cost. And that's kind of like what we have in Mississippi, Houston, Texas. There's a number of regions in the country that do not have net metering. It might be a local electric co-op. It may be a regulated utility. On deregulated utilities, you can find some retail electric providers voluntarily offering a little bit less than what we would consider to be net metering, but it's better than what regulated utilities are offering their customers. And I think that that's a clear argument for deregulation. If a deregulated market is providing more consumer protection than a regulated market, why is the market regulated? What benefit does the consumer have giving themselves to a monopoly if they could get more rights and benefits by being on a deregulated grid? And so, I think if utilities come too hard down on net metering and have no net metering, that's not the right answer. Although on the other hand, unlimited net metering, while the solar industry and the solar customer would really love that, it generates problems. With unlimited net metering, there's a few problems you might not immediately think about, but one of the big gripes is that I could outflow onto the grid in the springtime and the fall when the electricity really isn't valuable or needed, and I get a credit that will show up in the winter or the summer when the price of electricity is higher and that electricity is therefore more valuable. And so the utilities, look at these unlimited net metering plans and they're completely justified in saying, now wait a minute, that's a little too extreme. And then just to recap the other two options, we said, well, the annual economics are actually closer to month-to-month net metering rather than unlimited net metering, because often the utility will set the annual reconciliation date right at the end of spring when you want those rollover credits to go into summertime, but they don't. They get cashed out at the end of the month. So there's been a lot of debate on net metering and other forms of solar discriminatory rate structures, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for the solar owner. But net metering fundamentally is not a perfect policy, because what it says is you're entitled to retail credit when you outflow onto the grid or something around that. So what's the definition of a retail credit? If I'm outflowing at peak times and then I go to off-peak for my credits, is that fair compensation? If off-peak, the value of off-peak electricity is a quarter of peak electricity, is getting retail credit fair, or should I be net metering at the peak rate versus the off-peak rate? Or is the utility just going to net meter me at the retail value, at their retail value of electricity, regardless of what kind of individual rate structure I'm on? And then on top of that, you have an issue of, well, what happens if the homeowner moves? Because net metering is being rolled back throughout the entire country, and only in a few states have the grandfathering clauses been associated with the system rather than the account owner. And so you could have a net metering policy today, but when it comes time to sell your home, the new home buyer may not have access to net metering. And so if you've designed a system with net metering in mind, inevitably somewhere down the road it's going to be less valuable as net metering gets rolled back. And so the common solution is, well, why don't we just wait for battery prices to drop, and then eventually we'll buy some batteries and store our energy on site and not outflow to the grid at all? And won't that be nice? We can get the full value of our electricity that way, regardless of net metering policy. Well, actually, it doesn't quite work that way. Let's say you wanted to effectively day trade electricity. So let's say you wanted to, charge. Let's forget about solar for a minute. Let's just say you wanted to buy a Tesla Powerwall because you have an electric vehicle, and maybe Georgia Power is giving you this. Normally they might be at a 13-cent a kilowatt hour rate, but because you have an electric vehicle, they put you on a electric vehicle charging plan where they move you to 23 cents on peak and 6 cents off peak. And so you think, well, I'm going to buy a Powerwall because I'm going to charge at 6 cents and I'm going to discharge at 23 cents, and I'm going to make a lot of money that way. Well, what we forget in that kind of calculation is that batteries actually have a cost to use it. And so when you buy a battery bank, you buy whatever size or whatever technology of battery bank you're using, and then whatever size it is, you have a cost per kilowatt hour, which we can see certain kinds of lithium-ion batteries are much more expensive than others. And so we got our upfront cost of the battery. We also need to know what is our average battery usage. Because if I have a 105 kilowatt hour battery bank and I'm only using it 30% of that, on a daily discharge, I'm not using 105 kilowatt hours of it. I'm using more like 31 or 32 kilowatt hours. So depending on what technology you use, some battery technologies can be much more deeply cycled. The Powerwall 2, you could fully discharge it down to 0 and then all the way back up. That's not quite the whole story, but that's what the basic high level of it is, that lead acid, you're only supposed to be discharging to 20 or 30% on a daily regular basis. And then there's other more expensive battery technologies that you can further deep cycle. And that might mean you get away with a smaller battery, but that doesn't necessarily mean that battery is more cost effective. And we're going to talk about all of this in class. So this is just to kind of prime your thoughts. And then you get the cycles that are, we're going to show you how to read battery charts, but the cycles are somewhat related to how you're using the battery, how deeply you're cycling it. Actually, the Tesla Powerwall comes with a warranty that's not based on depth of discharge and cycles, but because they are a 100% deep cycle battery, their warranty is simply based on the energy output. And so there's not much energy efficiency loss in the Tesla Powerwall system. And then there's other kinds of batteries. What we can see is one big difference between the Tesla Powerwall battery and the lithium iron phosphate battery is if you multiply, let's see, this probably isn't that clear on the slide, but let's pull up our calculator here and get rid of all the red ink. What we're going to do is we're going to take the 42 kilowatt hour battery bank that's being discharged on a regular basis. 74% of it's being discharged, and it's warranted for 10,855 cycles. That's going to tell us how many kilowatt hours came out of that battery total over its entire life. And so, 42 kilowatt hours times 0.74. So on one cycle, we're getting 30 kilowatt hours out of it, and 10,585. What we're seeing is we're getting substantially, here we have 330,000 kilowatt hours out of this battery bank, and that this Tesla Powerwall is only rated for substantially less than that. And so even though the lithium iron phosphate battery is substantially more expensive than the Tesla Powerwall 2, it does deliver a total levelized cost of storage that's cheaper than the Powerwall. But one thing that does not include is the cost of capital. And so, the Tesla Powerwall says we're going to go for actually, this is kind of surprising. The Tesla Powerwall lithium iron battery, or lithium ion battery, is actually a cheaper lithium ion battery than what other manufacturers make, like Sony, that do lithium iron phosphate, which is a little more robust. And so Tesla is kind of going after we think of Tesla as being a premium brand, but they're really going after the Honda of batteries, whereas Sony might be going after the Lamborghini of batteries. And it also doesn't take into account the cost of capital, which generally speaking, it's this capital cost that's the issue. It's the capital cost that says, well, I like the Tesla Powerwall and I think lithium ion's a better technology, but I can, for my off-grid, get so much more capacity for so much less money if I need it. Or with, you could say, likewise, the lithium iron phosphate delivers a lower total cost of ownership, but that's, that's assuming the price of batteries remains stagnant. It actually might be more cost effective to go with the more expensive battery that has a shorter life, and then see where the battery market is at 10 years from now, 15 years from now, or even 4 years from now, given that we see the exponential growth of the battery industry is accelerating. What that means is the cost of batteries is going to continue to fall. So we have a question: do inverters cost vary with different battery types? And yeah, that's a great question. We'll explore it more further, but the answer is yes. One competitive advantage that the Tesla Powerwall has over the existing battery inverter companies that are on the market. It was kind of a weird announcement a few years back. Tesla said, well, we're going to start making our own inverters. It's like, well, why would they do that? They're already making their own panels. They're already making their own batteries. Why do they need to take on yet another scope? And the reason is well, they can build their inverter to be exactly what their specific lithium-ion battery is capable of, nothing more, nothing less. And that means the inverter components are actually cheaper than, say, an SMA or a Schneider or an Outback battery inverter that is designed to accommodate a wide range of options. They tend to have a little bit more expensive components. And then off-grid inverters are more expensive than grid-connected inverters, and we're going to get into all those reasons why in a minute. And to some extent, you get what you're paying for. If you're buying a more expensive battery inverter, it's going to have a lot more features. For instance, it might be the difference between, if you just go buy a Powerwall and it's for getting through power outages that might be 10, 15 minutes or up to maybe an hour, versus trying to live off-grid every single day, you might need a different inverter for that. But we're getting a little too far ahead of ourselves in the technology discussion. We have 6 hours. We're going to get to that. But what I want you to think about is look at the levelized cost of storage, and understanding that this doesn't include any interest or the cost of capital. This is just what it would cost, the upfront cost of the battery today divided by its total energy output gives us this rating. And we see flooded lead acid being around the 17 to 19 cent a kilowatt hour mark. We just did an off-grid house and actually came out to be a little bit less than that in our final bid. But that's, we see lead acid at the top of the range, Tesla Powerwall, kind of in the middle. And then these options are really not that realistic for most customers because they're just too expensive. And so what we see today is the battery market, the batteries cost between 15 cents a kilowatt hour up to 19 cents a kilowatt hour just to run. Every kilowatt hour coming out of that battery bank is degrading the battery electrode and ruining its life. When you use a battery, you shorten its life. And so when you look at, say, a time of use metering structure, and you might say, hey, I'm going to charge at 6 cents and I'm going to discharge at 23 cents. Well, you have to remember that, let's say you use the Tesla Powerwall, that might cost you 15 cents a kilowatt hour to run. And so effectively, my electric rate is 21 cents a kilowatt hour when I combine these two together. And so I'm only saving 2 cents a kilowatt hour by day trading electricity with my battery bank. What we really need to see is that this differential between outflow compensation and inflow compensation to be about twice the value of twice the cost of using the energy, so that we get a simple payback that is around 50% of the product's useful life. And that's kind of similar with solar. Solar has a 25-year life, but if you sell your customer on a 20-year payback, no one's going to buy it. You really only see customers wanting a 12-year payback, 11-year payback or less. And then with a battery, to make money off a residential battery, you're just not going to get there. If you're just using the battery on a time of day rate structure, and the battery is rated for 10 years and you're just spinning your wheels, you might only get your money back at the year 10 mark. So why would, you really haven't done anything. You've just wasted your money that you could have been doing other things with. And then on top of that, the time of day rate structures are not available every single day. It's quite common for them to be only available in the summertime during the weekday. So maybe only 4 months a year for 5 out of 7 days. And so you really don't have opportunity to cycle that battery on a daily basis. So even if it could be cost effective, if you had access to time of day metering on a regular basis, like an extreme rate structure, it's still going to be hard to get there unless you have year-round access. And so one market where batteries are cost effective is Hawaii. Because in Hawaii, the cost of electricity, and this is just in like Waikiki, Honolulu, the most urban part of Hawaii. You go off into the more remote islands and electricity cost goes sky high from here. But because the cost of electricity is so high in Hawaii, solar has grown to the point where they're no longer allowed to outflow onto the grid. And so the outflow compensation is zero, is nothing. And the inflow rate is not 23 cents, it's more like 35 cents. And so, the Tesla Powerwall as a residential day trader of energy, it works in Hawaii. Because every single day in Hawaii, the option is to just waste the energy that you would be outflowing, because you're actually not allowed to outflow. You have to curtail that power or burn it off. So it's just a wasted opportunity. And then at night, you're buying back from the utility at 35 cents. So in Hawaii specifically, you could buy a Tesla Powerwall, and it might have a 10-year life, and you might get a 5-year payback on it, and that's great. People are going to do that. But what that also means is that Hawaii is going to buy all of the Powerwalls before they make it to Iowa, in the middle of the United States where the price of electricity is low. What that means is when you're looking at battery markets, at least on the residential level, you're going to have to look at markets where the average price of electricity is quite high, like up in Hawaii range, in order for residential batteries to be cost effective. And so, it's not just in Hawaii where you can find these ranges, but in rural areas, mainly up on the East Coast or out in California, but there are other rural electric cooperatives, even in Kansas, where the average cost of electricity is substantially higher than the rest of the state just because there's fewer cooperative members. And in these areas, you might find a time of day rate structure that incentivizes battery usage at the residential level. In all other markets, residential batteries for the time being are not going to be cost-effective add-ons. And so you have to sell them for different reasons. And we're going to get into that in a minute. This slide's a little out of place, but it's just saying that utilities are also major installers of batteries. And these are more for pilot projects, so they can get an understanding of how a battery needs to be set up and commissioned with the grid to help levelize, their power. But utilities are interested in pilot projects. Residential customers, we've we've seen that what they think is not what will happen. You know, the residential customer thinks, I'm going to buy a battery and day trade electricity, but by the time they analyze the cost of that business model in most of the United States, they're going to conclude that that's not worth it. And so why would a residential customer want a battery? Well, it's mainly because, you know, let's look at Hurricane Sandy victims in New Jersey. You know, New Jersey is a big solar market. New Jersey has a high price of electricity here. And so, and they've had some really good solar incentives on top of that. So if you're a solar fan in New Jersey, you probably already have a solar array on your rooftop. Then Hurricane Sandy rolls in and it knocks out the power grid for 2 weeks. And, you know, regular solar arrays, because they are kind of hardwired into the grid, they have to shut off when there's a power outage. And so imagine how dumb you must feel in New Jersey to have a $30,000 or $40,000 solar array on your rooftop and you don't have electricity. You know, that's you become you should be the emergency hero of the community, and now you're the laughing stock of the community. And all you need to do in that case is to get a battery inverter and a battery and AC couple it. You know, just land it on the same panel as the solar array, and there's some additional things you need to do. You know, this battery is hardwired into the grid as well. And so just like with a generator, you know, a generator has the same thing. You know, it wants to power your load, but it can't backfeed the grid. So when you get into battery design, you're dealing with transfer switches that will disconnect the home from the grid so that your solar and battery banks can be active. And these batteries only need to be about 440 amp hours at 48 volts, and that's you know, that's for a situation where the battery inverter is not designed to fit with the battery chemistry. And so 48 times 40, you're looking at about a 20 kilowatt hour battery bank at the residential level using the traditional methods of battery inverters. And then the Tesla Powerwall is only about 7 kilowatt hours, so it's substantially cheaper. And so the idea is, if you can just buy a transfer switch and a Tesla Powerwall, and you might not actually try and size the battery bank to day trade electricity. It might just be a $5,000 or $6,000 add-on to a residential solar project that says, well, you know, if you want to use power during a blackout, you need to spend at least $6,000 to retrofit a Powerwall onto your array. Otherwise, you can't use it during a blackout. And the customer is buying it not to make an economic payback on their battery, but to have more power security during a blackout. And then the question is, well, how much power security do you want? Because if you go with the 7 kilowatt hour battery bank, that's hardly, you know, think about your microwave. You know, that might be your microwave might use 2,000 watts, or a tankless water heater can get up to 20 kilowatts. So it's like the Tesla Powerwall only has enough power in it to run a tankless water heater for about, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. You know, that's not very much. So is the customer going to be happy? You know, what's happening is you have to think about, in an emergency, what is actually needed. And Puerto Rico is a great example of that. You know, sure, it would be great to go and do this 20 kilowatt hour battery bank, or, you know, I'm doing an off-grid home where I'm doing a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, and all of that is nice and good. But what's worse is when you have no access to power at all. You know, in the Tesla Powerwall model, where you buy a battery that really is too small to run your home off-grid, effectively all you're doing is enabling the system to function in an off-grid mode during the day, and then at nighttime you'll run out of power, or you'll have to very closely manage your electricity to the point where it'll be like not having any power but maybe your refrigerator will stay on and you'll be able to run a couple fans. But that's a lot better than nothing. So it's this kind of interesting trade-off on how much more money will a customer pay on a solar array to add a battery to their system that will really only provide daytime backup power. And that might not sound like a very good deal to you or me who've never been through a long-term power outage. But if I'm a Hurricane Sandy victim or I'm in Puerto Rico, I would say, sure, give me all the electricity you can during the day. I don't need electricity at night. I can go to sleep and wake up in the morning and use electricity all over again. So, what kind of disaster preparation do you want? And you can integrate generators to provide additional power. So we're going over high-level stuff right now. We're going to get into the design brass tacks as we go along. What that means is that there's some innovative inverter companies out there that may not be designing systems to run a home off-grid, but instead they may be grid-connected systems with a dedicated sub-panel. And so when the power goes out, they still power the sub-panel to your critical loads, but they don't power the entire home. I'm a big fan of powering the entire home. I don't like critical load panels because, to me, if I'm doing an off-grid house, and the battery bank gets low, I'd rather we manage the energy through being smart about our appliances rather than kind of protecting it with a critical load panel. But that might not be the same if you only have a really small battery and you just want to make sure that the air conditioning, the garage door, and the refrigerator stay on, and maybe a couple power outlets to plug in, and that's it. A critical load panel may be all you need. And so maybe you don't actually need necessarily a transfer switch if the inverter has a separately derived critical load panel where a smaller transfer switch would actually be built into the inverter itself. Now, there's a company in Portland, Maine called Pika. It's a Pika inverter. They're a startup, and I've never used their product. They seem really small to me, but they're taking advantage of saying, well, we don't need to have a full-blown off-grid expensive inverter that the system might cost around 50 cents a watt, which is high for an inverter budget. But the Pika inverter may have fewer functionality, maybe more only designed to get you through a 30-minute or 60-minute blackout, not powering your whole house, but just powering critical loads. But it also drops the price of that inverter. Pika's combining it with a couple other really good ideas. One is, they don't do the module level panel electronics where you put a box behind every single solar panel on the array. Instead, they have this box just at the end of the circuit. So all the modules go into this DC voltage regulator, and that sends a constant voltage to the inverter, kind of like the SolarEdge system with the DC optimizers, but instead of buying dozens of the optimizers, you're only buying a handful, and you can connect them at the edge of your array to assist maintenance and stuff like that. Where Pika is taking it a step further is they've developed a battery management system that they can just plug in multiple batteries anywhere along this DC bus and combine multiple battery chemistries together. So you could have, theoretically, a lead acid battery providing your base energy use cheaply, and then a lithium ion battery coming in and manage the spikes and surges in your electric load. This is all kind of the future of the industry. A lot of these design concepts are not being supported by the battery inverter manufacturers on the market. That doesn't mean installers aren't asking about it. So there are a couple, when you get into product selection, there are some battery inverters on the market that you can do the solar array today and add the battery tomorrow. But your traditional battery inverters like Schneider or Outback or SMA, kind of the big names in batteries at this time as far as the inverters go, they're all designed to for only one battery chemistry. So the titles of these slides, we've been kind of talking about what's on the slide and not the title. We got a couple of different options here for starting out with our battery design. And the option is, do we want to AC couple or do we want to DC couple? And with AC coupling, you know, this might be your let me pull up my pointer. This might be your battery bank. And this is where your, you know, solar array is. And where they land is on either a supply side connection on a dedicated service panel, or they land on your load panel right next to each other. But with AC coupling, the AC output of you have two inverters, and the AC output of the battery inverter and the AC output of the solar inverter are landed on the same AC service panel. In DC coupling, it's a little bit different. The DC output of the solar array, and there's usually a voltage regulator or a charge controller upline that regulates the voltage going down to the battery. So once you get done with the voltage regulator or charge controller or whatever you call it, you have a constant voltage going into the inverter. And so for a lead acid battery bank, that might be 48 volts. For the Tesla Powerwall, it might be like, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a higher voltage system, and that gives it a slight cost advantage as well. But the point is, in DC coupling, you actually have a DC bus bar and a DC service panel with a DC bus, and you're landing the battery bank and the charge controller solar array onto the same DC bus. And it's a little confusing because if you're doing a small off-grid system, you might just go from the array directly to the charge controller, directly to the battery, and then directly to the inverter. And you might not realize that what you're creating is a DC bus at that level. But once you start to expand the systems, you have, you know, multiple charge controllers, you know, multiple solar arrays, you have multiple battery banks, you have multiple inverters. They're all going to be tied into a DC service panel. And actually, a lot of the battery inverter manufacturers want to sell you the accessories that say, look, you're going to need an AC service panel for connecting to your loads, and you're going to need a DC service panel for wiring up the batteries to the solar array, to the battery inverter, and they'll usually sell you a service panel that can combine all of those functions, where you'll have a separate DC side and a separate AC side. That's kind of exciting that we're actually getting into DC panels and some DC output. So the question is, which is better? Is it better to do AC coupling, or is DC coupling the better way to go in terms of system efficiency? Well, it really depends on whether or not your system is interconnected. Whether it's residential or utility scale, all interconnected systems, you're going to get better efficiency if you do AC coupling. And so with AC coupling, what they call it is a one-step process, because you take the output from your solar array and you do one conversion where you go from your inverter into your load, or it could also be the electric grid itself. But you only have one point where you're taking that DC output and converting it into AC output through your inverter. With DC coupling, you would go from your array through that charge controller, and then you would go from the battery bank through your battery inverter, and that is simply 2 conversion processes, which is less efficient than 1 conversion process. And so if your goal is to primarily run off of a grid connection, and you're trying to offset your electric bill with your solar array, but any outflow, the question is, you could use it to charge your batteries, but in most cases, a grid connected battery is going to be just hanging out at full state of charge anyway, especially at the residential level. It's just going to be waiting around for a power outage. And so you really don't use the battery at the residential level. And so what you want is this one-step process that goes from the solar array through the solar inverter into your load or into the grid. Whenever you use your battery in an AC coupled system, it's less efficient than a DC coupled system, because you go through the inverter, the solar inverter, and then you go back through the battery inverter, and then you go back through the battery inverter, and that's a 3-step process. And so if you're using the battery, it's a 3-step process. If you're selling directly to the grid, it's only a 1-step process. Whereas with DC, whether or not you're going into the grid or into your load, it's always a 2-step process. So the question is, when it comes down to whether it's best to AC couple or DC couple, it really depends on how often you're using your batteries. If you're using your batteries primarily, the sun is up for maybe 8 hours, 9 hours a day of production of healthy solar production in the summertime. The day is 24 hours long. And so you're going to be using your batteries in the summertime every day during night. And in the wintertime, you're going to be using them even more. So if you're doing an off-grid design, you are running off of the batteries much more than running off of the solar array. And so because you're running off the batteries primarily, you go with DC coupling for a more efficient use of your battery bank. It's not a 3-step process. Instead, it's a 2-step process. But when you go back to AC coupling, for most interconnected systems at the residential level, the battery bank is just going to be sitting there hanging out and not doing anything. So rather than process the energy through a 2-step process, you just want to use the 1-step process. We're really splitting hairs here. It's not that big of a difference between AC coupling and DC coupling at the residential level. The main thing is, when you're buying a system like this, which is more of an off-grid setup, it is cheaper. You have lower upfront construction costs to go with 1 inverter and a charge controller rather than 2 inverters. And the difference is the price of the charge controller versus the price of a solar inverter. And the difference is only about 10 cents a watt. And so it's really not that big of a deal whether or not you go with DC coupling or AC coupling. DC coupling, a little bit less upfront construction cost. AC coupling, a little bit more total system efficiency when selling directly to the grid. My recommendation would be to do DC coupling for off-grid and AC coupling for everything else. But what's more important is just to remember that this is a flexible system architecture. And so if you have a battery bank that is AC coupled to a solar array, you could always add additional capacity by DC coupling and have a system that has both AC coupling, DC coupling. So sitting here and debating the merits of which is better, AC coupling, DC coupling, the first point is that DC for off-grid, AC for grid connected. The second point is, if you want to deviate from that, you're not going to substantially change your project budget. Okay, so what this graph shows is, it says, what about high monthly solar interconnection fees? Because eventually the utility is going to say, well, we're not going to do, we might be state mandated to do net metering, But what we're going to do is we're going to raise our monthly meter fees and lower the price of energy. And so even if you have net metering, the utility could change their policy to devalue it. And one trend is to give solar owners a different rate structure than non-solar owners. So you would call this a solar discriminatory rate structure. And I'm not sure how fair solar discriminatory rate structures are in the grand scheme of things, but what it would look like is a utility comes in and says, well, normally your meter fee is $15 a month, but since you have solar connected to our grid, we're going to charge you $60 instead of $15. And so you might think, well, can I avoid interconnecting the solar array to the grid? You know, can I take my building off grid during the day and then reconnect to the grid at night so that my solar array is actually not interconnected to the grid, so I can avoid this solar discriminatory rate structure? And what that configuration is called is grid assist. And so instead of, you know, on normal AC coupling, your solar array is here, your battery bank is here, and you have a transfer switch, and normally the solar will be outflowing. But here we have a transfer switch. What if we move the solar array, you know, dispensed with the generator and moved the solar array and then kept the battery bank here? You know, what that would allow you to do is switch between the grid and the solar array without losing power to the building every single day. So when the solar array is on, you connect to solar. When the solar array is off, you connect to the grid. And the only reason why what you lose by doing that is you lose the ability for the solar array to outflow onto the grid. And so in a very anti-solar market where you're facing solar discriminatory fees and you're not getting very good compensation for your power output, you know, that's where a grid assist configuration can come in handy. Although I do have to say that in order for this automatic switching to occur, what's most common is to connect the neutral of the entire system together. And the utilities have been kind of positioning themselves, and you can see it in National Electric Code, and also in, at least I consider Mississippi Power to be very anti-solar. And you know, Mississippi Power on their website has defined any solar array that touches any electrical wiring that at any point is connected to the grid is considered to be a grid connected system. So I'm not, you know, grid assist was something I discovered in Europe and Australia, where they've substantially rolled back their incentives and are implementing these relatively harsh solar interconnection requirements. But I'm not sure in the eyes of National Electric Code if that argument of, well, the solar array is never, you know, the hot lines of the solar array are never physically connected to the grid. You know, the utility may step in and say, well, we don't care, we still consider it to be a grid connected system. And that opens up a very interesting debate on well, what, you know, legally, how much authority does a utility have to regulate the inside of the wires inside your home? Usually the utility is you know, on their side of the meter and not your side of the meter. So to kind of summarize the residential market, you got two markets. One is the off-grid market, and there's different market segments. There's low-end off-grid, there's high-end off-grid. You know, low-end off-grid, you might be doing the cheapest system possible, and the system owner is actually really into managing their nighttime energy use. And it might be, you know, I call it the hippie retirement plan, because you can go and buy dirt cheap land in the middle of New Mexico and buy some cheap solar modules and one battery inverter and a bunch of cheap lead acid batteries. And you know, the land is so cheap because it doesn't have any services. And so you can build your own grid, find some cheap land, and get away from society. You know, that's one kind of off-grid customer. Another kind of off-grid customer is pretty much one with deep pockets, like the high-end residential customer who in the past would buy a solar array with a 20-year payback just because they wanted to be the early adopter. You know, that same customer, now that their solar array might be getting them a 10-year payback, you know, they might just say, well, even though it's not economic to spend another 20 grand on a battery bank, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway. Kind of a luxury market. Both of those markets are relatively small, and I think as the Tesla Powerwall becomes more readily available, and it's not just the Tesla Powerwall, LG Chem also is one of their major competitors. You know, really where I see the residential market being is simply to connect an AC coupled small battery to existing solar arrays, particularly in areas where hurricanes or tornadoes could take out the grid for a long period of time. But my favorite market for batteries is the commercial market. Commercial customers are billed differently for their electricity than residential customers. Commercial customers are billed based off the top of their building energy use. You know, this is kilowatts. Whereas residential customers are more commonly billed by the kilowatt hour. And so in other words, residential rate structures, you're more commonly billed for the volume under this curve, whereas commercial bills, maybe the volume under the curve is only half the bill, and the other half is their maximum peak over the billing cycle, over a 30-day window. What is their maximum sustained tip-top 15-minute building demand over the course? So if this little peak is only for 5 minutes, you know, what they do is they take your 15-minute average. And so to put it into a formula, you know, what we have is residential structures are more likely just to be kilowatt hour based, but maybe up to half or more of a commercial electric bill could actually be billed very differently than residential. And so in a society where electricity costs 12 cents a kilowatt hour, residential customers are being billed at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and maybe they have a peak and an off-peak rate that's more like 20 cents and 6 cents. But as we just talked about, for those customers with time of use rate structures, batteries are still not where they need to be cost effective. And so the residential market is still going to be a, no, batteries aren't cost effective, but for 5 or 6 grand, we can give you backup power during a blackout, at least during the day. It's that kind of, you know, why spend the money on a generator? You don't want to deal with a generator, just get a Powerwall. And blackouts, you don't really have them that frequently anyway, so don't worry about it. Just go with the flow. You can always add a generator later. But commercial clients are, how they get to that average cost of electricity of 12 cents a kilowatt hour is a completely different path. And it's not just, you know, the kilowatt hour is time based, whereas the demand charge is instantaneous. So very, very different billing metrics. And so this is a sample of, I guess, about 20 different utility rate structures, looking at their demand charges. And what we see is one utility is way above the rest of the pack in the $18 to $20 a kilowatt range. This other utility is in kind of the $14 per kilowatt range. And then most utilities are in the $6 to $8 a kilowatt range. And what I think is very interesting is that the utilities that are up in this higher demand charge range, they don't have to be on the East Coast or out in California where the price of electricity is high. You might find a utility where the cost of electricity is only 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour, but when you actually open a commercial bill, they're buying their energy for essentially at cost. You know, they're buying the energy for 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and solar at 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour is simply not going to make economic sense. But even when your cost of electricity might be 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour, a commercial bill in that same area might be 3 cents a kilowatt hour for the energy, and then up in this $14 to $20 a kilowatt charge for demand. And usually where these higher demand charges occur, if outside of high-priced electricity markets, high demand charges occur in rural areas, because to push all the power that that manufacturer needs to run their instantaneous manufacturing process, you know, the utility has to supply it that power, and so the more demand they need is how they bill it out. So we look at a demand charge bill, and just for a minute, let's look at the average. Let's say you have a demand charge of around $10 a kilowatt, and then you have a base rate of 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So this is what I think is typical of most commercial customers throughout the United States. You know, you can get into more extreme in Con Edison in New York. You can get more extreme in California as well. But this is middle America. You know, this is where electricity costs 11 cents, 12 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe even less. It's likely that you'll find around a $10 demand charge and a 6 cent energy charge for a mid to large size commercial client. And so let's say they're buying electricity at 6 cents a kilowatt hour and then paying the demand charge. Well, we already learned that that Tesla Powerwall might cost around 14 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour to operate. And so to buy the electricity and then to run it through the battery and discharge the battery, plus any smaller system inefficiencies associated with that, you're getting into maybe a 20 cent a kilowatt hour total cost to charge and operate the battery. But look, it's $10 a kilowatt. And so if I only need to shave 1 kilowatt off of my building demand, even if my building peak demand is kind of similar from day to day to day, you know, the difference might be, let me erase all the ink. You know, here we have a day that's a good sunny day. And right at the tail end of the day, you know, that's when people are leaving the building and they're opening the doors, but you're still running your air conditioning unit. And so the battery only needs to run for a very short period of time, maybe 5 minutes, to level out this peak, to bring it down to your average demand and not your peak demand. And then on this other sunny day, you know, what we're seeing is that solar does reduce building demand on sunny days. You know, if we have a building whose peak demand occurs in the middle of the day, solar on a sunny day is producing in the middle of the day, and that's keeping that building demand much lower than it otherwise would be. The problem with demand savings in solar is not sunny days. The problem, and it's not necessarily cloudy days either. On an overcast day, your energy use in general is down. So what is problematic with solar is on partly cloudy days where the solar array is just not quite producing what it would under full sun. And so that's when the battery, shown in kind of yellow here, that's when the battery clicks in. And so we're not really using the battery every single day. You know, so going into our calculation, we have a battery bank that between the price of electricity and the cost to cycle the battery bank, it's about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So to operate the battery inverter system for 10 hours, it'll cost us $2 to operate it. But if that is me using the battery bank for 1 hour or for 3 hours a day, 3 days a month during those exact partly cloudy conditions where my demand value is being destroyed without storage, I'm not really using my battery hardly at all on these days. I'm only using my battery in this example for 30% of the time. Depending on how spiky this curve is, if I'm only running the battery for 10 hours, it's going to cost me $2 to operate, and I'm going to shave $10 off of my bill for a total net savings of $8. And if it really only took me 10 hours of generation to save $8, that's effectively, what we've done is we've turned our solar array, at least the battery is operating, we can assume that the solar array is going to be operating at the 6 cent a kilowatt hour rate. And by itself, for a commercial client that's doing a 100 or 200 kilowatt commercial rooftop array, if they generate at 6 cents and they only get that commercial payback, well, what's that going to be? We've learned in our solar class, you should be able to calculate this by now. If we have 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and then we multiply it by, let's just say our solar array produces 1.4 kilowatt hours per watt per year, 1.4 times 6, what that means is we're going to have about 8 cents a watt a year in payback. And so if I have a 10-year payback on my commercial array at that point, I need my total project cost to be around 80 cents a watt. And then if we back out the federal tax credit with that, 80 cents a watt divided by 0.7, we really need a commercial array install rate of around $1.10 to $1.15 a watt for that commercial array to even begin to make sense. And most commercial customers, they don't want a 10-year payback. They want something less than a 10-year payback. So commercial flat roof markets where the price of electricity may be 12 cents, because the solar array can only generate at 6 cents, the economics are not there. And that's why we don't see all these flat rooftops combined, all these flat rooftops with solar. But when you combine it with a battery bank, and the battery bank is generating at 80 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 6 cents a kilowatt hour, what we've effectively done is turned the solar array into a peaker plant, where the effective generation rate of the array, maybe you don't need to do 100 kilowatts or 200 kilowatts. Maybe you do just enough to qualify the battery bank for the tax credit, and that's it. And instead of doing a solar array that covers the entire roof, you install a solar peaker plant on top of the commercial facility, and then down the road do an expansion once you've gotten your money back. And so what I've done here is I've looked at markets where the price of electricity might be 12 cents a kilowatt hour, the price of electricity might be 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And I've assumed that you're going to roll up your sleeves and go through a very competitive bid process, maybe taking on some of the scope yourself to get that residential bid down to $2.50 a watt. And most do-it-yourselfers are knocking out projects, even when they hire a little bit of field help, of around $1.60 to $1.70 a watt. So I definitely think that if you go out with a hard bid, maybe drive some of the design process and not let the installer do so much, you can get that price down. So this is typical of a residential solar array in most of the country, assuming that the solar industry is operating at mainstream construction margins rather than specialty margins. So lower price projects at 12 cents to 15 cents a kilowatt hour, either you're in a southern climate where you're getting more energy out of the array, but the price of energy is less, or you're in a northern climate where you're getting less energy out of the array, but the cost of electricity is more. So this is kind of the flyover states, all the way from Albuquerque, New Mexico, up to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where Half Moon is located. And what we see is if you can obtain this $250 a watt project cost with the federal tax credit, we're seeing paybacks of between 9 and 10 years. And what I think is fascinating is, let's say the commercial array, let's say the solar array costs $1.50 a watt to install a 100 kilowatt array. And then you spent $2 a watt on your battery bank. And let's just assume for the time being that that allows your system to operate, in a somewhat cost-effective manner. If this 12-cent rate is mostly energy and only a little bit demand, the payback is about the same. If the energy rate is very low and the demand charges are up on the high end of things, the payback is actually better. And this is exactly where we are in Mississippi. We're actually halfway between that. We're halfway between the 6 cent and 3 cent and 10 and 20. We're at about $15 a kilowatt and about 6 cents for our energy. And what that actually means is that in Mississippi, where the choice would be doing residential solar and giving customers a 10-year payback, or doing larger commercial projects with batteries at a higher budget, but the payback is actually better for this commercial market than it is residentially. And what that implies to me is that this should hold true for most areas of the country where you have the flat top commercial roof market being the smallest market segment out of residential, commercial, and utility scale. And yet it is also the most cost-effective market now that cheaper batteries are coming online and converting what used to be a solar discriminatory rate structure that destroyed the value of solar. And there are utilities like Arizona Public Service, which proposed to move all of their solar customers onto these demand rate structures in order to stop the revenue loss from net metering. But now that cheap batteries are coming to market, it's actually accomplishing the opposite thing, where the heavy demand rate structure, those solar advocates that fought so hard against those demand rate structures in Arizona, if they had a little more foresight, they should have just said, okay, we agree. Because all they had to do is wait about 3 years for, the Tesla and LG Chem to ramp up their facilities before using batteries to load level becomes cost effective. In fact, we look at even higher priced electric markets where you get into, this is like Con Edison, where you might be spending between 8 and 4 cents on your electricity, but you're up into a higher demand charge. You can get commercial paybacks with solar batteries that are substantially better than residential paybacks in the same market. And so we're actually there's this kind of secret transition that is just about to occur in the solar industry, where all the utilities have been looking at energy rates and net metering and saying, oh my goodness, we have to do something about this. We're going to push everyone onto demand charges. Well, now batteries are ramping up and they're going to do more to impact utility revenue than the solar industry has done in the past 10 years. I mean, solar is still only, 2% of our electric grid, and the vast majority of it is utility scale. So the utilities who are arguing about revenue loss caused by solar are to put it softly, I would say they're looking towards the future and saying this is going to be a problem for us down the road. But batteries, man, when you think about it, if half of a commercial electric bill is demand charges, and maybe half of those demand charges could be reduced by batteries, and maybe half of a utility's revenue comes from demand charges, keep in fact that every commercial business out there, not every commercial business can buy a solar array and put it on their rooftop, but every commercial business out there can buy a battery and start doing some demand management. What we're going to see is a half times a half times a half. That's 1/8. We could see utility revenue drop by as much as 12% across the entire country over the next 10 years because of cheap batteries. So in fact, I think cheap batteries represent a much more disruptive force to the utility than solar will. You combine the two, and they're even more powerful than they are individually. And I think that will force the utility into rate structures that are not itemized like this, where you don't have a fixed energy rate and a fixed demand rate, but instead you have little pricing tiers that say if you stay within this demand and this energy use, and you pay $60 a month, or you can go into our expanded plan and pay $100 a month, and that your electric bill is going to more closely resemble a cell phone plan. And that begs the question, well, does a consumer have a right to an itemized electric bill? And I think that's a very interesting discussion, because in the past, public utility commissions have said, look, not only does the consumer deserve an itemized electric bill, but they deserve a simple electric bill. But maybe the smart grid is changing all that. Now that we can see our electricity on our smartphones and have switches that are intelligent and smart, maybe the public utility commissions will give the utilities more flexibility. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is maybe in the future our electric bills are more square, where rather right now they're more functions of volume and amplitude. Ultimately, it's kind of like the utility sticking their finger into the leaky dam. It might be a stopgap measure, but eventually, what we could see is so much solar comes to the grid that it drives the price of daytime electricity down to zero, and maybe the grid operators still charge non-bypassable charges. It's really the generators who are in trouble. This is a graph that I thought was pretty influential when I was just getting into the solar industry. And what they say is that, what it says is that pretty much for any energy efficiency upgrade, you have to have a payback that is 10 years or less in order to sell anything. And even at that rate, when you're at a 10-year payback, you're only going to be making a very small percentage of your projects. Whereas if you had a better payback, more customers would move forward on it. Well, solar's never going to get to a 1 or 2 year payback. If it were at a 1 or 2 year payback, we would be fast on our way to free electricity, and that would do the Star Trek universe. Then again, I think what's much more likely is that we'll see the price of daytime electricity go down to zero, at which point your net metering policy is going to be worthless anyway, because the value of your export is nothing. And so, I don't think net metering is for a variety of reasons, is a very long-term, future-thinking policy. And I think that's important for us to start designing our systems with the mindset that net metering will not be around in the years to come. And so what we see is Arizona Power and Light was looking at demand-specific charges for solar customers up to $14 a kilowatt. All of these states have residential demand rate structures, and you might actually surprise yourself. You might have been thinking, just like this utility, that demand rate structures are bad for the consumer, but then, let's just face it, consumers want batteries. They don't want their solar array to not work during a blackout. It's just been a cost issue. So if you can find a way to actually improve the system payback by moving them onto a demand rate structure, that's going to give you a much better competitive advantage than the solar installation companies whose current mindset is that demand rate structures are bad and energy rate structures are good. And so for that, you just have to go on to your utility website, and like here's a energy storage rate that you might see demand charges on it. Here's a residential demand metered service. So that would be the energy storage rate might be more like time of day metering, which may be cost effective for a battery-less system. But if you have a customer who really wants a battery, check out to see if they have any demand rate structures available. It may make the project a little bit more cost effective. And so when we look at the battery market to say, okay, if you really want to get into batteries, you know, sure, there are some off-grid preppers out there who will buy either cheap arrays or quite expensive arrays, depending on the level of luxury that they want to live in. Sure, there's also an emerging residential retrofit market where we can just go to existing solar arrays and add batteries to all of them. But there's also this fact that the commercial market segment that used to be the largest market segment in the US solar industry is now the smallest, because without those local $2, $3 a watt incentives at that energy only rates, or at that energy rate at half the value of electricity, your array is generating almost at avoided cost. And so it's been very hard for these commercial projects to come out of the ground because absent storage, they haven't been able to provide demand savings, meaning that the generation rate is much closer to avoided cost. But keep in mind that commercial solar can be installed for almost half the price of residential solar, and then batteries can provide that demand savings to improve project economics. You know, if the utility scale market crashes because of the solar subsidies effectively being wiped clean, and in fact, if the solar tax credit goes away, the import tariff will effectively mean that we're taxing renewable energy while we're letting you know, even if you don't think that carbon pollution has an impact on climate change, no matter how you feel on climate change, you know, they're still pumping particles into the atmosphere. And I don't think that it's a responsible environmental policy to have free dumping of any kind. You know, that's what permitting is for. You know, I think public opinion is going to change on that as renewables get lower in price. You know, as renewables become cost effective, we might see the public start mandating renewable friendly policy. It could be that in the next few years, we're actually running in the opposite direction where I know Rick Perry has proposed some subsidies for the coal industry. Pruitt has wanted to get rid of the subsidies for the solar industry. All of that says to me as an installer in this industry that the utility scale market is going to pop and that the residential market may remain stagnant. But it's this commercial market where you don't have to cover the entire rooftop, where you just have to do enough solar to fill those batteries up with renewable energy so that they qualify for the tax credit. So if you charge the batteries with regular power, it's not going to qualify for the tax credit. If you charge the batteries with solar, you're going to get 30% off. And so you do a solar array that's just large enough, that's right size to fill the batteries up, and then you do your batteries, you're not exposing the project to substantial import tariffs because the solar array might be 100 kilowatts instead of 1 megawatt or 100 megawatts. Half your project budget or even more is coming from your battery bank furthermore, and that might be how you stay in business over the next few years if the US solar policy really goes south for the utility scale sector. So knowing where electricity is expensive is a great starting point for locating where demand structures are high. And so that's not just California or the East Coast, but here's Iowa. In Independence, Iowa, electricity is 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And that might mean that they have a 6 cent generation rate for commercial customers and then a very high, $14 kilowatt plus demand rate. So it's not just in New York City or San Francisco where batteries are making sense. Batteries make a lot of sense out in California because they have incentives for batteries. You get a 30% state tax credit on top of that. So there's a lot of battery work going on in California. But if you're not in California, if you're in Colorado or Arizona or even Kansas, these are markets where electricity prices are sufficiently low. Go out into the countryside, look at your rural electric cooperatives and see if they have demand charges for their customers, and that's really where the market is going to be. And on top of that, not all commercial businesses have load profiles that go on throughout the day. So in Mississippi, we get a lot of farming operations, and if it's like a pig farm, or if you're raising cattle and you're bringing all the cows in to eat, generally you do that first thing in the day in the morning. And so you might be running your silos right in the morning, and that might be your peak demand throughout the entire day. And so for customers who are not seeing typical business load profiles, but actually have much more spiky load profiles, the battery savings can be even greater. So for all these reasons, you're going to have to start collecting the building energy use data in advance. And I think that that's great because that means that we have to put more thought into design work, and you can start selling design and feasibility studies without trying to sell the client on the entire project all at once. So then we get to utility scale, and I do not have I don't have any project experience with utility scale batteries. It's still right now kind of a pilot process, but again, utility scale is grid connected, and they want the solar electricity to go into the grid. The batteries are only being used for an hour or two a day to help levelize the ramp up between the solar production going offline and residential evening energy use coming online. They call it the duck curve. And so you're not running the batteries 20 out of 24 hours a day. You're only running the batteries 2 hours a day. So you're primarily dumping all of the electricity into the grid. So again, from residential to commercial to utility scale, whenever you're dumping your surplus electricity into the grid, you're going to want to go with AC coupling. It's only when you do off-grid where DC coupling becomes cost-effective. Okay, so with that, we are, let's see what time it is. I think we're getting close. Let's see. Yeah, so it's 12:30 Central Time. Why don't we take a 15-minute break, and we'll pick back up at 1:45. So let's take 15 minutes, and then we will see you back again. All right, we're gonna pick back up in about a minute or two. All right, so welcome back. This image is just a high-level picture of our electric grid. And for utility scale batteries, where these batteries are being located right now are kind of on solar farm or wind farm job sites. But that's not the only place where they could be located. Some concepts are, hey, can we put batteries, at the distribution station or even on the distribution circuit transformers, so that when what happens right now is when failure occurs on the distribution line, it isolates all the power on that distribution, and that can be a problem. One is if there's too much solar on this distribution circuit, some of these distribution transformers are not able to be backfed. And so what happens is they read the electricity flowing in the opposite direction as a grid failure, and then they shut off power. So in a rural area, it's not, the utility's not being unkind if they say, well, we already have too much solar outflowing onto the grid. And either with that, you would do like the SMA inverter has a zero export mode where you don't output power onto the grid, or that grid assist configuration we talked about. Either one is essentially equivalent. In Texas, they kind of have a problem because they've deregulated their grid so that and battery storage has been accepted as power generation. So even though you're just storing the power, it's still considered power generation. And so in Texas, they say if you're a power generator, you can't be a transmission or grid operator. And so it becomes a problem on who's going to own the distributed batteries spread throughout a distributed grid. Maybe they've taken grid deregulation a step too far. This graph is really not important to the program. I should take it out. It's something we talk about more when we get into energy sales in the community solar program. But what I would say is that what a utility is trying to do is they see kind of a peak demand right in the middle of the day. This is 5 p.m. And so in the past, they can kind of slowly ramp up and ramp down their power capacities. Well, now what solar's doing is it's turning on around 9 a.m. and flattening this peak, and then it all ramps up at the end of the day. And so batteries at the utility scale are really being run during this time frame to help the grid ramp up to its evening peak. All right, looking at the growth in the battery market, lithium ion is by far and away in the lead in terms of scaling up its production volumes. And so, battery storage has recently passed mechanical storage as far as ways we store energy in the United States. So chemical storage is kind of winning, and lithium ion is out in front of the pack. It's not that you can't use lead acid for batteries, but it's more common to use the lithium ion battery banks. They're certainly accepted as kind of the future technology. And then, to some extent, there's the impact of the tax credit, where if you get 30% off everything in the store, you might be more likely to go and upgrade a battery to a better technology. But really, where I see battery selection coming into play is the question of, well, do you need a battery that is for almost 24/7 operation, like in an off-grid home, for a large usage, at which point you might be in lead acid just because of cost. It's the cheapest. If you are having a battery really just hang out and not do anything all day, like a residential backup battery, and you're not doing an expensive large array to really go off-grid without sacrificing quality of life, but if losing power at night during an emergency is acceptable to you and doing a small solar array is more affordable for you, there's really not much reason to go with lead acid at that point. The main advantage of lithium ion over lead acid, besides from responsiveness, and it is more responsive, it is more efficient, but the main advantage is the lead acid batteries do require some maintenance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Lithium ion batteries are more maintenance free. This, I think, is a good chart to kind of show you the capabilities of lead acid versus lithium ion and other kinds of storage technologies. There is another battery type called flow batteries, which is kind of the next step in our march towards fuel cells. But the only flow battery company that I know of, Redflow, it's an Australian company, they've announced that they're not targeting residential or commercial, and they're just going into utility scale. And that might make sense because, with that utility scale, they know kind of every day that the battery is going to be turning on at noon and operating towards 5 or 6 in the evening, and whatever it can outflow, it outflows, in a slow and steady pace throughout that time frame. So it's not utility scale batteries do not need to be as responsive as, say, a commercial battery, where as soon as your building demand spikes up, you want to turn on a very responsive battery to efficiently reduce that peak. And so lithium ion, actually the technology is better suited for commercial demand management than lead acid. But then again, if you have a very smooth energy curve rather than a spiky energy curve, you may not need the responsiveness of lithium ion. And maybe that lead acid is fine with that. And so we have to be, one way that a solar installer can develop their knowledge is not just doing the solar design, but also, maybe speccing out other appliances on behalf of the client to say, no, if you want to do batteries, don't go with a tankless water heater. Like an off-grid, it may be better to go with a tank water heater than a tankless, because you could charge the hot water all day and at a constant rate. Whereas with a tankless water heater, instantaneously your building demand surges by 20 kilowatts, at which point you really need a lithium ion for that to be effective. And so we're doing, on our off-grid home, we're using lead acid. And what that means is we have to be very cognizant of hey, if we're buying a refrigerator, can we get a variable speed frequency drive in that refrigerator, rather than it having a duty cycle where it clicks on and clicks off and clicks on and clicks off. We might have it so that the duty cycle runs continuously throughout the day, and that would be less stressful on our lead acid battery bank. Likewise, if we had one issue, there's other ways to manage your energy, which we'll get into. Flywheels and supercapacitors, their niche is more when you're charging and discharging in a matter of seconds. Now, with a commercial demand management, it's being itemized by a 15-minute period or a 30-minute period. So you don't need a response time of seconds, you just need a response time of minutes. And so what are flywheels and supercapacitors really useful for is energy storage systems like electric vehicle regenerative braking, or elevator systems where the elevators are climbing to the top of the building in a matter of seconds and then dropping back down to the first floor in a matter of seconds. That you get flywheels and capacitor systems into those kinds of design, with lithium ion being particularly well suited for either maintenance-free batteries or commercial demand management, and then lead acid still being kind of the battery of choice for the off-grid market. The few kinds of batteries to consider. We did an off-grid project recently where we looked at a couple of different battery technologies as an alternate to flooded lead acid. So, our client said, I'm comfortable doing battery maintenance. He's a farmer, so he does regular chores on his property, watering his batteries, and especially because we have this watering kit, so you don't really have to water every single battery. It flows throughout the entire thing. Doing a little bit of maintenance was not an issue to him. We looked at, as an alternate, we looked at a nickel iron battery bank, which also requires maintenance. So these are two kind of batteries that produce emissions. They'll produce hydrogen gas. The battery needs to be vented for that reason. Actually, an air-conditioned room qualifies as a vented battery bank. But they also produce corrosive gas, and so and you want to protect the battery as well from accidental contact. So for a variety of reasons, even if you're storing your batteries in a vented garage, you're still covering the batteries with some sort of protection to capture any off-gassing and vent it out of the room. You don't want that gas getting onto your metal components and corroding your metal. Here is a Trojan lead acid battery line. And what I want to point out is first off, we have the 6-volt battery, the L16RE, A and B. And there's not much difference between these two. The B is a little bit better than the A, but not much. That's less than 10% difference between these two batteries. And I bet you the more energy dense battery costs about 12% more. You make that up on installing fewer batteries. But the flexibility in lead acid is not really there. So here we have a 6-volt battery versus a 2-volt battery, and we have 303 amps coming out of the battery versus 909 amps. So what we can see is they've dropped the voltage by 1/3, and then they've multiplied the amperage by 3. Now a volt times an amp equals a watt. And so what they're essentially saying is within this battery line, all the batteries are the same size. They've discontinued their T105 actually. So within this premium battery line, all the batteries are the same volume. It's just a question of, do you want more volts or do you want more amps? So when do you decide if you want more volts or you want more amps? We'll talk about it in a little bit. Now we get into other product lines where we can see these 6-volt batteries where the amperage is actually increasing. Usually what this means is this battery right here, it may weigh 100 pounds and only be 1 foot tall, just making up some numbers here. Whereas this battery may weigh effectively 2.5 times as much and effectively just be 2.5 times taller. So when you're buying a more powerful battery of the same battery chemistry, the more powerful your battery, the larger and heavier it can be. And so the one issue is, all else being equal, do you go with the 6-volt battery? If we're going up to 48 volts, do we go with a 6-volt battery or we go with a 2-volt battery? Well, it might depend on how many amps you need. If you need 909 amps, then you may be going with the 2-volt battery rather than the 6-volt, just so that you have the amperage that you need within this product line. Or then you start getting into more industrial batteries where you find a battery that has the amps that you need, and it's a 4-volt. And so you need, if you're 48 volt, you need 12 of these instead of 8 of them. And also they're much larger than this line. And so the question is, well, do you go with this 2-volt 900 amp battery or this 4-volt 1000 amp battery, you know, the issue is the 4-volt battery with slightly higher amperage is going to be over twice the physical size and weight of this 2-volt battery. And so if I'm doing the hippie retirement plan, buying cheap land in New Mexico to go build my little off-grid prepper community, I would be going with the lighter weight battery and installing multiple batteries because of transportation issues. But if I'm doing an off-grid home where we already have some offloading equipment on site and we can just take a giant heavy battery bank with a battery crane and drop the batteries right in place, you know, then you might get into slightly more cost-effective industrial batteries where you only have 8 batteries for the entire system instead of 48 batteries. It's just that they're much heavier and harder to manage. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, when we talk about batteries that require maintenance, what are we talking about? Well, if a battery requires maintenance, it's going to go through a failure mode. And on top of that, if a battery has an issue of, well, it's not a deep cycle battery, well, you can't discharge the battery all the way down to 100%. You know, what that means is the battery has some weaknesses in it and some failure on, well, why can't we discharge the battery all the way down to 100%? And the answer is, well, if it's operating in a deeper range, it's going to destroy the battery much more quickly than it's operating at the top of the range. Now, these ranges have specific terms applied to them in terms of their charge cycles. And they call it float, absorb, and bulk. And so the float phase occurs at the top of the battery. And so you notice on this chart, it doesn't go up to 0%. It says it keeps it at 20%. Depth of discharge is where the graph kind of starts. And you really, on lead acid batteries, the rule of thumb is don't design to more than a 30% depth of discharge. That's the general industry rule. Well, look, there's a couple of things going on. These are actually charts for 2 different lead acid batteries. And the lead acid batteries, one is for this premium line, and the other is for this industrial line. And what we see is the industrial line battery is much more flat than the premium line battery, where we have a much more of a bow in that battery. And what this is referring to is the float, absorb, bulk phase, where the bulk phase is all the way down past this inflection point. So once you start discharging the battery, it's kind of like a stress and a strain curve, where you got the stress right here, and then you got the strain right here, and here's your point of inflection. And so this is the bulk phase of the battery versus the absorb versus the float at the top. And what this graph is indicating is that once you get up to a 20% state of charge, going from the charge of 20% up to 100% state of charge is going to push this curve higher and higher and higher. And what that represents is that to take a battery from an 80% state of charge and charge it all the way up to 100, it requires a lot more energy than to operate in this more elastic absorb range. You can put all that energy to charge the batteries up to a top, but when we talk about a 48-volt battery bank, those batteries are commonly rated for 60 volts and not 48. So they're designed to operate at 48 volts, but you could actually drive them all the way up to 60 volts if you had a lot of energy to do so. And we haven't talked about it yet, probably get into it tomorrow, but the way that batteries degrade, you can prevent the battery from degrading by charging it up all the way to the top of the float every so often. It's just not energy efficient to do so. So you don't do it on a regular basis. Like if you live off grid, you may not have you may have enough energy to top the battery up to the top, but when you go and you run these battery maintenance cycles to cram even more energy into it to get it up to the top of the 60 volts, that's called your float phase. And you're really only doing that maybe every 2 weeks during heavy use, and maybe once a month during the spring and fall when you're not really running your battery all that much. The absorb phase reflects how deep you can discharge the battery before you begin to damage it. And so this is kind of the greatest misconception in the battery industry, is lead acid can only go down to like a 30% depth of discharge before you start to hurt the battery. The answer is, well, it depends on what kind of lead acid you use. You know, if you use a bottom shelf lead acid, it might be even less than 30%. It might be 25%. But if you go and you use a industrial forklift lead acid battery, which costs a lot more, you know, this strain curve may not begin to bend until a 65% depth of discharge. And so you might actually begin to discharge the battery much deeper than you would normally. Now, this is assuming kind of a steady, constant discharge rate that you can accomplish through good appliance selection. But if you're talking about a more responsive demand management, that's talking about a different issue entirely. We'll cover that. But what I want to point out is between these two product lines, the premium line and the industrial line, the premium line of this manufacturer can only be discharged to about 35 to 40%, whereas the industrial line could be discharged to about 65%. And I can tell you the premium line, it may cost you $120 a kilowatt hour, whereas the industrial line that you can discharge down to 65% may cost you $240 a kilowatt hour. And so there's not an incredible amount of trade-off by using an industrial battery versus a renewable energy battery. So which is better, to use, you know, what the manufacturer says is our premium line for residential renewable energy batteries versus going and buying the same lead acid batteries that forklifts are powered on? Well, the answer is the battery that can be discharged twice as deep and it costs twice as much. It's usually by going deeper, you're generally buying a heavier battery. And so these industrial forklift batteries become problematic when actually trying to move them around on site, whereas the renewable energy battery, yeah, you might need to buy twice as many of them, but they cost half the cost. And the big difference is now you have twice as many batteries to wire up, but they're more transportable. Versus using an industrial forklift battery, you know, you might have a lot of problems during the install moving the batteries on site, but once they're landed, you only have, you know, a very small amount of batteries to deal with. We'll look at some pictures when we get into the case study. So then so that kind of talks about lead acid for a minute, and I group nickel iron in with lead acid, and these will all come back when we talk about our case study in more detail. So then we get into lithium ion batteries. And so we really have lead acid that I see lead acid finding a niche in the off-grid market where you just need the raw capacity, and the lithium ion batteries are just too expensive right now. In the off-grid market, generally you have a more rugged individual who's willing to do some battery maintenance. So then we get into lithium ion batteries, which are maintenance free. And so the major players in lithium ion right now, we got Tesla. Actually, LG Chem is and Mercedes also compete with Tesla, and they're a little bit ahead right now on the pricing curve. So these and distribution. So right now installers are really moving to LG Chem or Mercedes, even though technically they're more expensive than the Tesla Powerwall. The problem is it's just very hard to buy a Tesla Powerwall. They haven't really ramped up their manufacturing yet. And then there's another company called BYD that is making some waves as well. It's more of a Brazilian company. Then you get your top shelf lithium iron batteries, which generally speaking are called lithium iron phosphate batteries. So it's a LiFePO4, whereas the lower end is just referred to as lithium ion. You got lithium ion, which is a lower end lithium battery. Then you got lithium iron phosphate, which is a higher end lithium ion battery, such as that really expensive Sony battery. But then Sonnen and Simplify are two US companies that make the very expensive higher end batteries. So the question is, well, which do you use? Do you use a lithium iron phosphate battery, or do we use the Tesla Powerwall? Well, if we're trying to design an off-grid home, you know, if we're really aiming for like a 100 to 122 kilowatt hour battery bank, you know, maybe with doing a deeper cycle, we can go into the Tesla Powerwall and kind of stay within the same price range. And it's kind of within the same price range as well. And the big difference is if I go with the Tesla Powerwall, it's a more responsive battery and there's no maintenance, but also there's that hard difference of having a 120 kilowatt hour battery versus a 65 kilowatt hour battery, where, you know, if your goal is to live off grid and never run out of electricity without really thinking about it, having that extra storage, particularly in a industrial forklift battery that could be deeply discharged if it had to be without wrecking it, you know, sometimes you just, it's a question between maintenance or storage capacity. But then there's these lithium iron phosphate batteries that are jaw-droppingly expensive, like this Sony battery that we modeled that was $1,400 a kilowatt hour instead of $407. And so, you know, if we went with a lithium iron phosphate battery, it would be 3 times as expensive, but the battery might last, you know, 5 times as long. And so it has a substantially lower levelized cost of energy, but the capital cost is too expensive. And so you might look at this and say, well, what is Sony doing? You know, why are these lithium iron phosphate batteries, I really have to pay $1,400 to store a dime's worth of electricity? That's never going to make economic sense. Well, it depends on what the application is. You know, where lithium iron phosphate batteries come into play, like, sure, you might get Michael Dell building his off-grid compound in Hawaii going with a lithium iron phosphate battery simply because he can afford to do so, and its longer life means that he can install the system now and never have to mess with it for any maintenance at all. But where the lithium iron phosphate batteries are really coming on strong, and, you know, I asked there's the software called Energy Toolbase. We'll look at Energy Toolbase a little bit more tomorrow. We've already seen some screenshots on it already. But I asked the company founder of Energy Toolbase which he sees modeled more often for commercial demand management. Does he see lead acid or lithium iron phosphate, or just regular lithium ion? And he said it's almost overwhelmingly lithium ion because it has that right balance of responsiveness versus cost. And then when you're doing commercial demand management, you know, you're not really worried about running out of power because you still have the grid there if you need it. So the total capacity of the battery bank is really less of an issue than if you were doing an off-grid home. And so where the more expensive lithium iron phosphate batteries come into play is not in residential or commercial building design, but in smaller applications like a weather monitoring station or a National Park Service bathroom in the middle of the woods, where you only need a tiny amount of power to power your instrumentation and monitoring and LED light bulbs, but you know you never want to ever step foot on that site again for the next 30 years. You know, for your extreme remote applications where the on-site power demands are not that large, you know, spending a few $1,000s on a lithium iron phosphate battery will give you, will give you a 30-year maintenance-free battery. So finally, we get to the bottom of this this list, where we get to nickel iron, and like flooded lead acid, nickel iron will require maintenance. And so we look at this nickel iron, and it actually is the cheapest battery on the market. But the only problem with it is that, and it's a deeper cycle than lead acid as well. So you crunch the numbers, and you can say, okay, well, you know, this industrial lead acid will last for 4,000 cycles at a 20% state of discharge. We can go and do a smaller nickel iron battery that'll do a 80% discharge and last 2.5 times as long, and that's going to be our most cost-effective option. Well, when we get into our case study, you know, the conclusion was, well, sure, it might be the cheapest battery, but the upfront cost is going to be twice as much, or even greater than twice as much as doing a flooded lead acid with similar performance. So even though the levelized cost of storage for flooded lead acid was twice as much as the nickel iron, you know, what came into play was the flooded lead acid battery bank is only going to last 11 to 15 years, whereas that nickel iron, you're actually buying, for a 30-year battery, you're buying 30 years worth of cycles. And who knows what the battery market's going to look like 15 years from now. It's going to be a lot cheaper than it is today. And so maybe if your budget's strained, going for a 30-year battery may not be the best strategy. It might be that you do the battery that you can afford, and whether that's a 4-year battery or a 10-year battery, what's important is that you get a payback that's underneath the battery life, and then swap out the batteries over the years to come. So let's get into our case study. This is for a residential off-grid project, and it's new construction. So the challenge was we didn't have any site data in terms of energy use to go off with other than the client's existing electric bill. And in his existing electric bill, they were doing electric hot water tank. And the new construction, they're doing a wood-fired hot water tank. You know, Mississippi, we have a lot of wood resources, or in the solar industry, we would call it surface carbon rather than subterranean carbon. But we're making some major appliance changes, and I'll show you how to model that. But after we adjusted his current consumption of his existing home for the fact that the new home is going to be more efficient and have less electric intense appliances, what we got was a month-by-month printout of how much energy he's going to use over the given month. And we converted that into a daily average per month. And so what we can see for this site in Mississippi is that in the springtime and in the fall, energy use is way down. And so we see that energy use climb up in the winter, and then we also see the energy use climb up in the summertime. So we really don't have to worry about spring or fall in terms of running out of electricity for the off-grid home. What we have to focus on is, are we going to run out of electricity in the wintertime when demand is up and electrical use is down? Or are we going to run out of electricity in the summertime where demand is way up, and even though solar production is up in the summertime, maybe might not be up enough? And so for that, we go and use our very family-friendly PV watts calculator, where rather than talk about it, let's do another real quick PV watts calc. So here we are on PV Watts. We go over to Starkville, Mississippi. And it connects to the local weather station. Then we're going to go select this nearest weather station right here. Now, what's really important is that you pick a weather station that fits your geography, which is not that varied in Mississippi. But if you're up in the mountains, you want to check the elevation of the weather monitoring station to get a similarly located station. Even if it's an hour away or 2 hours away, it's better to pick a station that closely fits your geography. If you live on the coastline of Lake Michigan, you want to pick a weather monitoring station that's on the coastline of Lake Michigan. You don't want to pick a weather monitoring station that's an hour outside of town, even if it's the closest one, because you want a weather station that will reflect your climate. So we put in we ended up going with a 22 kilowatt solar array, and we went with the standard rack up on the rooftop. And I just keep all these things the same. It was like a 412 roof pitch. You click go, and normally in PV Watts, this is where we get to our month by month output of how much energy the solar array will produce. And in the solar class, I recommend doing a PV Watts calculation just for a 1 kilowatt solar array, because if you know how much energy, if I know in Mississippi 1 kilowatt will produce 1,364 kilowatt hours, as we talk about in other classes, minor deviations in the solar tilt angle, like going from south to southwest or going from a 412 roof pitch to a 512 roof pitch, that's hardly going to budge our actual performance. Going to a 26-degree tilt, like a 612. There's not much change in how much we produce a year. There may be some changes in how much we produce a month. And so if January or February is our problem, look, right now a 1 kilowatt array in January is producing 64 kilowatt hours, and in the summertime it's producing 143. And so we're producing almost twice as much in the summertime as we are in the wintertime. If this was new construction and I really wanted to optimize the tilt angle of my rooftop, you might go back and say, okay, well, my daily kilowatt hour consumed in the summertime is not twice what it is in the wintertime. And so I can go back to PV Watts and kind of play around with the roof tilts and say, okay, well, if I'm doing a 1 kilowatt array in Starkville, and I go with a steeper roof tilt, like a 45-degree roof tilt, now I'm producing about the same actually in the wintertime, a little bit more in the spring and fall, and a little bit less in the summertime. So increasing the tilt angle to make the array steeper actually doesn't give me any benefit, because I don't need electricity in the spring and in the fall. In the spring and in the fall, I already, that's when daily energy use is way down. What I need is energy in the summertime, and I also need energy in the wintertime. So going with like a 45-degree tilt angle instead of a 20-degree tilt angle, all that does is take away from energy in the summer and move it into the spring or the fall. So that's not particularly good. What I might consider is pulling up PV Watts and saying, okay, let's be crazy here. Let's throw common sense out the window, and let me take a solar module and bolt it 90 degrees down the side of the south-facing wall of the building. And what I can see here is that now, well, in Mississippi, it still didn't make that much of an impact. So I might as well just go with the shallow roof tilt anyway. But if you go into northern climates like the north part of the United States, or up into Canada, you might find that mounting not the entire array, but a couple of circuits might go down the side of the building and off grid to boost your wintertime production if that indeed is the priority. Like, it would be better to have a rectangular building where you have a flat array for summertime production and a perpendicular array for wintertime production, rather than having an array at a 30-degree tilt optimized for annual production. So your design can get a little bit more site specific, but again, the differences between most array tilts and orientations are only going to vary by about 20%. So it's not something I would lose too much sleep over. We're still in a situation where you're kind of conforming the array to the rooftop rather than the other way around. Now, going back to our PV watts calculation, you have a standard array on about a 412 roof pitch facing due south. Don't forget that in PV watts, you can get to this screen and scroll all the way down to the bottom and go and export this hourly import data. I know I mentioned it in other classes, but it's very important especially for off battery design, because what the PV watts data will tell you is in this hourly design where we get the data for every single, not just for the month, not just for the day, but it's taking hourly weather monitoring data from that weather monitoring station and says, okay, well, we know how much sunlight was in the air at the time. Let's check the weather conditions and convert it into direct irradiance versus diffuse irradiance. And so on January 1st, we see that we have no direct irradiance and we only have diffuse irradiance. And so on January 1st in Starkville, Mississippi, this is a completely overcast day where you have a big, thick gray cloud sitting on top of the array. Versus if we, the next day is like that as well. The next day is like that as well. The next day is like that as well. And then we see kind of a partly cloudy day where we're kind of half and half between the direct irradiance and indirect irradiance. And then some more cloudy days, some more cloudy days, some more cloudy days. It's one big gray cloud hovering in the wintertime. And finally, we get to a day that is more direct irradiance rather than diffuse irradiance. And in humid climates like Houston, Texas, or Mississippi for that matter, you're always going to have some diffuse irradiance because it's not just clouds, it's also particles in the air. Actually, carbon pollution can drag down the performance of a solar module. Most of it is dust and other kinds of factors, but about 8% of the dust particles collected on the surface of solar modules come from carbon pollution. And that should be an increasing problem, even though it might not be a major problem. But anyway, more importantly, what we get out of this hourly data is we can chart the entire year's worth of data and determine when the cloudy weather is going to be and when the sunny weather is going to be. And we go and we translate that into system performance. And look, this is kind of neat. You can see how much power the array will produce on a completely duck soup overcast day. And so we see this let's sum this up. Let me see, okay, well, on an overcast day, I'm producing 800 kilowatt hours. So 9 kilowatt hours, 53 kilowatts for 1 hour, 96 kilowatt hours for 1 hour. I produce 800 kilowatt hours or 800 watt hours over the course of the day. This is in watts. Yeah, so I produce 800 watt hours over the course of the day. Let's go ahead and scroll down to the sunnier day, where we have a lot of direct irradiance. So here's a fairly sunny day, although we do get a cloud at high noon. And so on this mostly sunny day, that 1 kilowatt array is producing 3,815. And so one takeaway that I get out of this is that you actually will produce some power out of your array on an overcast day versus a cloudy versus a sunny day. It's going to be about 80. You'll produce about 20%, maybe a little bit more than 20% out of the array on a cloudy day versus a sunny day. And so what we do in our solar design is we can take, let me eliminate this chicken scratch. We can take how much energy we're drawing out of the battery on a daily basis, and then we can graph it with PV watts to determine how much energy we're putting back in on a given day. And the net difference, you can do that calculation for every hour of the day, every day of the year, and track how much energy is going into the battery and how much energy is coming out of the battery. And you can go and look at how deep you can discharge your battery technology, whether it be 35%, 65%, or 100%, and size your battery bank such that you don't run out of electricity. So for example, here we have the average daily consumption, and we've taken our PV watts calculation and we've said, okay, how large of an array do I need in order to produce 48 kilowatt hours a day in January? How much do I need in order to produce 74 kilowatt hours a day in August? And what I can see is I need an 18 kilowatt to produce that much power in January, and almost an 18 kilowatt to produce that much in August. So that's pretty good. What that tells me is to balance out at the end of the month on a day-to-day basis, I need about an 18 kilowatt array. But what I have not taken into account for that is that I'm not an average consumption and an average production, but that's actually going to vary by overcast days. And so I'm probably going to want to oversize my off-grid array above and beyond 18 kilowatts so that I never run out of electricity. And generally, if you're doing a 10 kilowatt or 12 kilowatt, you might as well go up to 18 kilowatt. By the time you get through this detailed design process, the cost of the module is not the primary driver of the system. Then again, there are some other things to point out. If I was doing a grid connected system under net metering, 18 kilowatts would net me out in the wintertime, and 18 kilowatts would net me out in the summertime. But in the spring and the fall, I would need a much smaller array. And so if I'm doing this as a grid connected residential customer, I might be only selling this customer a 12 kilowatt system, but because he's going off grid, instead I'm looking more at a substantially larger system. So going off grid is going to be more expensive than staying grid connected. That grid connection has value, and not just a grid connection. You could use a generator and get through those January months. You could look at that day in August when you're draining your battery bank and say, okay, I'm going to do some energy management to kind of fix that. On this particular project, it's more that the homeowner was building a house and he just wanted to go off grid because he wants to be, he wants to be off grid. That's his prerogative. And so he knew it was going to cost him a little bit more money. Another issue with him is he did not want to worry about a generator. So we're about to talk about generators, and it turns out that generators really help you reduce your array size and reduce your battery bank size. But for him, he wanted the system to work without a generator. He didn't want to use a generator. I told him he had to. We ended up using a generator anyway. But the generator is there more to be a backup rather than to be used on a regular basis in the wintertime or in the summertime. And this is what the analysis looks like. And so we looked at how much energy on a daily basis goes into the battery and how much energy comes out of the battery on a daily basis. And we went and looked at the biggest deficit that we would draw, which occurred in July. So the deepest, without a generator, the deepest cycle of a battery bank was this point. And this is about 100 kilowatt hours from the top to the bottom. And so, you know, when we go and we look at we went with an industrial forklift battery. And we said, well, you know what? You know, we can once a year take this industrial battery that's really designed for a 65% depth of discharge. And if it happened to go down to 80% for one day out of the entire year, you know, we're not getting down to this 80%. I have to juggle all my drawing tools. We're not getting. Let me just do it with my mouse. We're not getting down to this 80%, except for this one storm cycle in the summertime. Otherwise, we're in that 65% range on up. And so we're only operating for the vast majority of time in the float range and not in the bulk range. So going back to our battery technology discussion about float, absorb, and bulk, you're really charging the solar array, charging the batteries with your solar array during the absorb phase. But once you cross this kind of point of no return and get into the bulk phase of the battery, if you continuously operate in this phase, your degradation will accelerate. And so once you get into the bulk phase, that's when you want to turn the generator on and charge the batteries back up. And so for us, using this industrial battery, you know, if we turn the generator on at the 50% mark, you know, those batteries are going to be well protected and last a very long time, especially if they're in a temperature controlled environment. If we go with the cheaper battery and we operate in this bulk phase, you know, basically we would have to either do a much larger battery bank or turn on the generator sooner so that we don't get down into that impact. And so looking at this graph, you know, to me, the client said, I don't want to listen to the generator. I'm going off grid. If I hear the generator running, I don't want to think, oh no, I'm about to run out of electricity. You know, he doesn't want to have to worry about running out of gas. He's spending the money to go off grid for peace of mind. So he doesn't want to have a more chaotic lifestyle. And so if we just turn the generator on at the 50% mark, what that means is we're going to be running the generator like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the 50% mark, it'll be 6, 7, maybe 8, maybe 9. You know, we really only need to run the generator 9 times a year. And even if we didn't have the generator, he still wouldn't run out of power. And, you know, for him, he has a wife and a kid in middle school. And the last thing he wants to do is move his family into an off-grid home and then run out of electricity. So we really shot the moon and oversized the system, but that's no big deal. You know, if you oversize your battery bank, you spend a lot more money, but you have this almost linear relationship between battery size and lifetime. So if you discharge down to 60%, you only get about 2,000 cycles. If you do half that, you discharge down to 30%, you get about twice as many cycles. And so oversizing the battery bank, it's not like when you oversize an inverter and you're just buying extra capacity that you're never going to use. When you oversize a battery bank, it's going to last. You know, if you oversize it by 50%, more than likely the worst thing that'll happen is you spend more money, but the battery is going to last 50% longer as long as it's well maintained. So oversizing the battery is not that big of a deal, other than the system becoming unaffordable. We looked at how much energy we're coming into the battery bank versus how much energy is coming out. We looked at, on a regular basis, not wanting to get down into the bulk phase. And so for, all the days of the year except one, we're in the absorb phase. So for the client's parameters, it's a well-sized battery bank. And what this is we're assuming the battery bank starts out full, and then we see those PV watts days of going with no sun, and then the sun comes up on January 5th. And then we go through some sunny weather, and the solar array is putting as much, we charge it up with the solar array, we draw out of it at night, we charge it back up with the solar array, we draw out of it at night. But then all of a sudden, we go through some overcast weather, and what we can see is the solar array doesn't produce enough energy to make it all the way up to the top. And that's going to be a problem whether or not you have a 22 kilowatt array or an 18 kilowatt array. On an overcast day, it's just you're producing 20% of what you would under full sun. So sunny days are no problem living off grid. It's, if you double your array size, you're going to get twice as much energy out of it, but that's still only 40% of what you would do under an array half the size on a sunny day. So it is, in most cases, kind of a waiting game to see, can you tough out the overcast days and really recharge on sunny days. Sometimes you need a generator to step in. What we can see is in March and in April and in May, it doesn't matter. It's mostly sunny days, and we're always slamming the solar array back up to the top. Here we're getting into summer, so we see our air conditioning loads increase, but we're still getting back up to the top. And then all of a sudden in July, we get maybe a hurricane system come through. So where we go a few days without sun, and then all of a sudden our July air conditioning loads are so large that the array can't charge back up to the top for a few days until you get some, completely clear days to get the array back up to the top. Now, in reality, this battery is going to be operating, not in its float and not really in its absorb phase, but it's getting further down into the bulk phase. So in reality, what's going to happen on this day is we're going to limit the battery bank to like 50% instead of 65. And as soon as it hits this mark, we're going to turn the generator on and get it back up to the top. So this became a metric that I found very useful in comparing different battery bank chemistries, because the client told me he didn't want to have to rely on his generator. And I can tell him, well, you don't need the generator, but we're still going to use it to help the batteries out. And we're going to be using it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times a year, maybe 12 times a year, just to keep the batteries topped up. That's independent of the maintenance charging cycle, although they can be, they're coincidental. So when you need to do more battery maintenance is when you're more deep cycling these batteries. So you can time them at the same time. And so what that means is he's going to be using his generator about 12 times a year. And I'm going to come back to these two slides. But that actually made it really easy for me to compare the 120 kilowatt hour flooded lead acid that could really only be discharged down to 50% or 65% compared to this nickel iron. We know nickel iron is more expensive, so it's how much smaller, given that the nickel iron can deep cycle down to 80% rather than 65%. How much smaller can we shrink the nickel iron battery bank in order for our generator runtime to kind of have a equivalent user experience? Now, when we're turning on this bottom graph is the nickel iron, this top graph is the flooded lead acid. You know, the only difference is, you know, we're turning the generator on for the flooded lead acid when it hits 50%. We're turning the generator on for the nickel iron when it hits 80%. We're running the generators, you know, kind of under similar weather cycles. And so what we did is we set the size of the nickel iron battery bank to reflect a similar user experience to the lead acid bank. And so in short, when you're doing your off-grid design, PV Watts is very useful. You can take how much power you're expected to consume on a regular basis, then you can extract your overcast weather days from PV Watts, and then determine, you know, how large your battery bank needs to be so that you don't run out of electricity or operate in that lower end of the battery capacity. It's not too hard to model this stuff on your own in Excel. Battery management systems are flexible. And so when you have, say, here's your off-grid battery inverter, and as we said earlier, if you have a string inverter with a solar array on it without batteries, you can just land your string inverter and your battery inverter on the AC service panel. So they can just be operated parallel with each other. Now, the reason why it doesn't matter if this string inverter is the same brand as the battery inverter is, remember, the string inverter has a grid protection. It's called UL 1741, and says if there's ever a power failure, this string inverter has to turn off. Well, let's just say it doesn't turn off because we've put a transfer switch between the utility meter and the load center, and we want to use the solar array during a blackout. So we have a transfer switch here. We're powering our whole house during a blackout. We have our battery inverter here to turn the solar array on because it provides the grid signal. So the main question is, these are not separately derived systems. So what happens if the solar array begins to backfeed the battery bank? Or if you have a generator as well, what happens if the solar array begins to backfeed the generator? In other words, what happens if your site is generating too much power? And that power, you know, your cheap solar inverters, as opposed to your more expensive battery inverters, your cheap solar inverters have to push all of their power out. And if they can't push all of their power out, they might burn up. But the problem is, you don't want to push all that power into your battery because you could burn up your battery bank. You don't want to push all that power into your generator because you could burn up your generator. So these, if they're the same, if you have, like, say, a Sunny Island in an SMA string inverter, they'll actually run a little communication circuit between the two. That might be over Ethernet, it might be over the neutral line, but it'll automatically curtail the solar array power output to be equal to the load. And so whatever your load is, your solar array matches it lockstep when you're in that off-grid mode. If they're not the same manufacturer and you don't have that communication, the way that the battery inverter protects the system is the same safety provision that the grid uses to protect its system from the solar array, and that the battery inverter will fake a power outage. And it'll do that by shifting the frequency of your power output signal, and that'll trigger the safety provisions in your battery inverter, in your solar inverter, to turn it off. And so even if you have a Schneider battery inverter and an SMA battery-less inverter, they can work together in the same system. It's just that you will be turning the solar array hard on and off rather than just simply curtailing its power. So this is only an issue if you're off-grid and you don't want to unnecessarily cycle your batteries. You'd rather keep the solar array on and have it directly feed the load rather than turn the array off, drain your batteries down, turn the array back on, fill your batteries back up, turn the array off, drain the batteries down. Now, you're unnecessarily using your batteries under that circumstance. But if I'm just doing a battery retrofit and I see that there's a Fronius solar array on site and there's no Fronius battery inverter, we have to remember that for residential grid-connected retrofits, the battery is really just kind of sitting there hanging out, not doing anything anyway. So this system elegance is not necessary. It's only necessary in off-grid. So I wouldn't worry too much about there being a mismatch between battery inverters and solar inverters. The only thing is the manufacturers say if you're double or triple or quadruple or putting 10 battery inverters because you want to have a giant battery bank, stay within the same line. So don't have multiple battery inverters from multiple manufacturers on the same system. Just stick to one product line at that point. Also, some additional flexibility is you can do DC coupling with charge controllers into your battery inverter and AC coupling as well. And so if you're planning an off-grid project, it may be that you start out by doing a DC coupled system to reduce your upfront capital cost. But if you find out that you actually need some additional power, you can always tack on more solar arrays through AC coupling. Generators, for that matter, are getting more intelligent. And so with generators, you'll often have a generator control module where they can turn on and off as a function of the grid going out. Now you tie your generator into your battery inverter, and your battery inverter will provide that generator the signal it needs to turn on. Some things that are important to note about generators is not all generators are the same. So you get higher end generators that are called inverter generators. And what a high end generator will do, it's often called an inverter generator, is that it will output its power as a function of the load. Cheaper, lower end generators will just output as much power as it possibly can. What's the difference between the two? Well, the renewable energy generator it's more about control and being able to turn the generator on and off and have it meet the load or complement the load. And so having that variability in the generator output is worthwhile. But if you want to do the low-end hippie retirement plan, you could have just a dumb generator, the kind of portable generator you just buy at the store for $2,000 or less, and you wheel it out during a power outage. That generator can work too. The only thing I have to say is when you get into lower-end off-grid designs with generators, not all generators can be turned off. Some of them can only be auto started rather than auto off. And so there are solar designers who say, you know what, I'm going to have a small generator, and if my battery voltage gets low, I'm going to just turn that on. But then if I'm having a more severe weather event, I'll have a larger generator with a spare tank reserve just for risk mitigation. There's, your solar, when we talk about inverter selection, that might become a little more clear. But effectively, what you want to look for your higher end residential systems is a stationary generator that's designed to work with renewable energy systems. My experience is that the early adopter solar community who really likes solar and batteries, they're not very excited about their generators, but you need them to protect the batteries. Here's another point. Going back to our float absorb bulk phase. The Tesla lithium-ion battery is rated for a 100% deep cycle, which means that it does not degrade at 30% depth of discharge or 50% depth of discharge. And what do you think its float absorb bulk line looks like? Here's our lower end lead acid. Here's our higher end lead acid. They don't provide this chart on a lithium ion battery because it looks like a straight line. It's completely linear. And so you don't have a float absorb bulk phase on a maintenance free lithium ion battery. And so you actually, on a residential system where the battery is just there to enable the solar array to turn on during a blackout, you may not actually need a generator. Generators might be more for off-grid. Then again, if you want to have power at night, then maybe what you have is a Tesla Powerwall and a small portable inverter generator to use as well. The problem during these real weather emergencies is that you run out of gas as well. So you run out of gas in New Jersey, you run out of gas in Puerto Rico, you run out of gas when you're in the middle of the woods and there's an ice storm and you can't make it out of your house. So generators are generally going to be more cost effective than batteries and solar for providing backup power. The advantage with solar is that you're generating your own electricity on site. And so from Puerto Rico, where running out of gas is a real issue, that makes your generators more efficient. And then if where the solar array is more assisting the generator, in an off-grid design where you're running primarily off solar and batteries, the generator can assist the batteries. Okay, so new construction, residential, we don't have any load profile data that tells us when the customer is using their electricity. What we want is for the customer to use all of their energy in the middle of the day when solar is productive. What we don't want is for the customer to heat their home at night and not heat their home during the day because it's sunny outside, and then heat their home at night again, because then our energy production may not be used. It may be, our energy production may be up here where it's just being clipped off the top and it's not a very useful thing. So what we want to do is load shift to say, can we put this into the middle? Can we put this into the middle? How do we do that? And also, we want to get an idea of what time of day our clients are actually using the electricity, just from a design standpoint. So one approach that Aurora Solar uses is a pretty good one. Some utilities will do this too, is they'll take your month-to-month electric bill and then break it into a daily average, like what we've talked about previously. So you take how much energy you use on an average day, and then you fill out a survey of what appliances you're using, whether it's a tank water heater or a tankless water heater, electric heat, gas heat. That's going to make a big difference. If you're on wood burning heat, you could eliminate your electric heater, and then your wintertime electric bill is really low. If you use an electric heater, then your wintertime electric bill is going to be really high. And so just from doing a survey of what appliances you're using and what region your building is located in, they've already taken building load profiles for your region, and based off what appliances you have, they will estimate the load profile for you. The problem that we had is I didn't know what the tip of this curve would be for the client. So I didn't really know what the maximum system output would be. We're used to having 200 amp service panels, but those 200 amp service panels are well oversized. Could we do a 100 amp service panel? Would the client be all right with that? Well, in my particular case, the client did not have access to his real-time electric use. So what I did is I hopped over into Oklahoma, kind of a similar climate to Mississippi, a little bit hotter, and that's going to drag down the performance of the array a little bit more in the summertime. So if anything, I'm going to err on the side of being conservative. My folks in Oklahoma had a similar square footage home, kind of a newer home, but they also don't do anything to manage their electricity. It turns out that every like 10 feet in their home, it's like they just moved to Oklahoma, so every 10 feet in their home, there's like a floodlight in their ceiling, recessed lighting. And I did a similar survey that AEP Oklahoma could let you fill out on their home, and AEP's survey determined that half of their electric use came from their incandescent floodlights in their ceiling. So I told them, look, you can go get LED floodlights and get a 2-year payback, and the answer was, well, I like the way this light works. And that was the extent of how far I wanted to pursue that conversation around the holidays. But what I could get is an AEP Oklahoma, they provide, without having to buy anything in additional, they provide load profile data to their clients through the electric account portal on their website. So it may be worthwhile logging in to your utility account or your client's utility account to get this kind of data from them. And in fact, there's a service called Utility API that for a fee will do all of that for you. So you can just put in the electric account info and it'll extract this load profile data if the utility is set up to provide it. That's supposed to be an advantage of the smart grid. I have a digital meter on my house and I don't have this data, but you might surprise yourself. Anyway, looking at my parents' similarly located, similarly sized, slightly larger electric use home, I saw that their peak power draw from the grid was 14 kilowatts. Now, one thing to keep in mind is a tankless water heater can be 20 kilowatts. And so if I had a tankless water heater, it would shoot up to maybe 30 kilowatts while it's on. So you really want to make sure that your home does not have any high kilowattage inductive loads that will immediately spike your load up into a higher amount. If you do have those higher loads, then you want to use them in the middle of the day when your solar array is providing most of the power, so that power doesn't come out of your battery bank. So you could, in theory, have a tankless water heater on an off-grid system that is simply there to heat water rapidly during the day when you have excess power available. Although a water tank electric heater, a tank water heater can do the same thing. So what I'm looking for here is what this is telling me is my inverter output capacity has to be around 14 kW. And so when it gets time into inverter selection, we're looking for an inverter that has a 14 kilowatt output. It's kind of interesting. In grid-connected battery-less system, you're selecting your inverter based on the size of your solar array. But when you DC couple, all the power goes into your batteries, and you're really looking, your inverter size is coming on how much power do you want to draw out of those batteries. And we're looking at about 14 kilowatts, given that our client is not really, he's using an electric water heater, but it's a wood water heater as well. The electric water heater is simply there for times when we have surplus electricity so that he doesn't have to use as much wood. But in the wintertime, on those overcast days, he could switch over. So what do we want in an inverter selection? Well, one thing is you want to check for a 240 volt split phase electric service so that it's the same as what most electricians are used to wiring. I mean, you'll find some battery inverters that will have usually they're 120 volts. Sometimes with three phase it can be a little tricky where you might use 3 240 volt single phase inverters rather than being able to find a 3-phase battery inverter for small commercial. One thing that we were kind of looking at with Schneider is Schneider had two. It's rated for doing off-grid and grid connected. And so on its inputs, it has two inputs, one from a generator and one from the grid itself before you land onto the inverter. And we're using the generator, but we're off-grid. So we don't need to go with the more expensive Schneider inverter that has two AC inputs. We could go with a cheaper Magnum inverter that only has one AC input. Well, I like the two AC inputs because down the road, that second AC input could be a more advanced lithium-ion battery bank. It could be that we move the older lead-acid batteries to the AC input side on their own battery inverter, and then on the load side, quote unquote, we have a lithium-ion battery bank to assist the grid. You know, it just gives you, if you have more AC inputs, it gives you more expandability down the road. That may or may not be an issue. For me, on my first off-grid house, I thought, well, the worst case scenario is I really mess up the design and he has to connect to the grid anyway, and we have that output there to be our insurance. Compared to a traditional batteryless inverter, your battery inverters are going to be more expensive. It might be that they started out as 120-volt battery inverters catering to a small off-grid market. So as they've gotten into battery, larger residential systems, you may have to add a transformer, which is an additional cost. Whereas your batteryless inverters are just trying to push all the power into the grid, your battery inverters will enable multiple modes of grid connection. So you could have a zero export mode. To get the tax credit, you have to actually charge the batteries with your solar array. And so you want to prioritize charging the batteries rather than exporting to the grid, even if you have an advantageous time of day rate structure, because losing the tax credit on the batteries would be worse. And so you have a mode for prioritizing battery charging when grid connected or selling to the grid when grid connected. You have an off-grid mode. You have a generator assist mode where the solar array is really just there to assist and add complementary power to a generator. And so you have more advanced algorithms which may require additional parts. The monitoring is much more complicated. You're not just monitoring the power output of the array, you're monitoring the power input from the array into the battery, the energy out of the battery, the temperature of the battery. There's a lot, so and you might be monitoring the battery temperature at a couple of different points. You might be monitoring the shunt of the battery. You might be monitoring your input from the grid so that you can, when your amperage draw from the grid exceeds a certain threshold, you can do the inverter turns on for demand management. So right now, one problem with battery inverters on the market is they're kind of a one-size-fits-all solution, where it's a very close pack of inverters that can do everything, and they're much more expensive than batteryless inverters. They're about twice the cost. And then you get into the generator auto start it may or may not be a standard option. It might be that the inverter manufacturer says, well, not all of our systems have generators. So to reduce the cost, that's going to be an accessory, even though it's a strongly recommended accessory. One thing that floored me when I got into this off-grid design, let me check my time here, coming up on the end. Luckily, we have another day, so that's good. One thing that shocked me is that when we went to go design this off-grid system, our system is up on a rooftop. And you can imagine most of these off-grid preppers, they're doing solar arrays down on the ground where they can service them. And so when I'm on the roof, what I'm used to is 600-volt circuits where You know, you're wiring the modules positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. You get to the end, and normal operating voltage might be anywhere between 350 to 500 volts. It's just on the coldest day of the year, it doesn't exceed 600 volts. And so you get these long circuits that are kind of sized to go up to 600 volts per National Electric Code. Now, what I was shocked to realize is that most of the charge controllers, and the charge controller goes between the solar array and the battery bank, most of the popular battery inverters on the market, your Outback, which I'd say is the most popular in the US, and at least in terms of reputation amongst the NABCEP install community. So your Outback, and then SMA also has a very good reputation. And what was shocked me was both Outbacks and SMAs charge controllers only went up to 150 volts instead of 600 volts. And so what that means is instead of having a circuit that's 8 modules long at 600 volts, our circuit might only be 2 or 3 modules long. And so what that means is if we're putting a 20 kilowatt array on top of this barn that's going to hide the batteries, house the batteries, and supply power to the home, on a 20 kilowatt array, that might be 8 circuits of modules for 600 volts, whereas we'd have to do 32 circuits for an equivalent 150 volt system. And one of the very common failure points of a system is these connectors, not necessarily the module-to-module connection, but the field assembled connector that connects the last module on the circuit of the solar array back to the charge controller. It's that field-made connection that almost uniformly, if there's a problem on commissioning and it's one string isn't working for a variety of reasons, almost uniformly it's because the installer did not make that connection correctly. And you know that happens to me too. You know, it's just not, it's not a really good connector when you get down to it. And so what that would have meant is that if we went with this 20 kilowatt array on top of the barn and we had selected Outback, we would have realized that we would have had dozens and dozens of circuits on our rooftop, and wiring would have been a mess. So that actually simplified things. Schneider, you know, only 2 companies, Schneider and Magnum, had a 300 volt charge control, and then Morningstar and Pika both had 600 volt charge controllers. This was the big difference that drove our final selection, was which inverter manufacturer had a 600 volt charge controller. If it was on the ground, if it was a smaller solar array, it would not have been that big of a deal. Most all of your inverters are scalable up to 200 kilowatts, so you can be double, triple, quadruple, quintuple stacking the inverters to make increasingly more powerful systems. You still have one inverter driving the whole system in kind of a master-slave electronics relationship. But most systems are expandable. Only Pika is supporting multiple battery bank chemistries. It's not that you can't do multiple battery bank chemistries. It's just you're on your own and you might void the warranty. So, you know, there's installers who will put say a grid with lead acid and a microgrid where on-site lithium ion complements the lead acid grid signal. But that's really the hackers who are on the cutting edge of design. It's not really a product you'd put forth to a client. And then the company size is actually kind of funny. Schneider and Outback and Magnum all come from the same kind of American/Canadian manufacturer called Trace Inverters, and then SMA comes from overseas. So the Schneider and the Outback and the Magnum inverters are very similar products. So what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to look at our final design, read some spec sheets, of battery inverters, look at all our other system parts in terms of charge controllers and stuff like that. Look at the actual size and weight of some of these batteries. Look at some battery control room requirements. Get a little bit more into the case study on some kind of fancy stuff that we did, and then look at our project budget, and then just, you know, a lot of it is just going to be going through spec sheets and looking at what these individual battery components do. We'll get a little bit more in depth into the Tesla Powerwall, and then towards the tail end of the day, start looking at how you actually wire these things up to each other. Finally, the last thing we'll do is look at load leveling opportunities, and also some of the design software that can help you do commercial battery bank modeling. So right now it's 2:15 Central Time. We're at the end of our program. This is part 1. So we will hope to see you guys tomorrow. If for whatever reason you are not connecting tomorrow, to get access to the course recordings, all you need to do is go to my website, community.solar, and then just type a little message into the chat bot that you're a Half Moon student, and I'll get you set up with course recording access. So with that, we're done for today. I'm going to pass it back to Half Moon, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you for the presentation. If you need continuing education credit for this webinar, please remember to take the quiz after the webinar ends. If you don't have time to take the quiz or it doesn't appear for you, you can always access it via the follow-up or thank you email that is sent out about 1 hour after the webinar has ended. Certificates will be emailed in PDF form, and if you have any remaining questions, you can reply to any emails you have received regarding these seminars or call into our office. Thank you to Mr. Cromer for the presentations, and thank you for everyone in attendance. We hope to see you tomorrow, and here is your quiz.